Have you ever wondered what it feels like to love a man whom the whole world fears? Viktor Volkov, the boss of all bosses. He didn't woo me with roses. He bought me with a blood debt contract. He doesn't just want my submission. He wants me to melt under his absolute dominance. A survivor knows how to stay alive, but a genius knows how to master a demon's heart. I am Aria, and this is the journey of how I became a phoenix amidst the ashes of the Volkov Empire. If it were you, would you choose to run for freedom or stay to become the queen of the shadows? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'll be reading and responding to every single one. The air in the Metropolitan Archive of Ancient Manuscripts didn't smell like the outside world. It didn't carry the scent of rain-slicked asphalt, cheap street food, or the heavy smog of a city that never slept. Inside these stone walls, the air was a thick, intoxicating blend of aged parchment, drying ink and dust that felt like it had settled a century ago. For Aria, this was her oxygen. She sat hunched over a heavy mahogany table, a jeweler's loop pressed to her eye, her fingers, clad in delicate white cotton gloves, steady as a surgeon's. Before her lay a fragment of a 16th century diary, its edges charred by a fire that had nearly erased it from history. "Just a few more millimeters," she whispered to the silence. Her voice was small, a habit born from years of working in a place where a loud breath felt like a sacrilege. Her phone vibrated against the wood, the harsh buzz jarring the stillness of the room. Aria flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. She stared at the screen. Dad. She closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of familiar dread washing over her. She knew this call. It was never a call to ask how her day was or if she'd eaten dinner. It was the call of a man drowning, trying to pull everyone else into the depths with him. She answered, her voice strained. "Dad, I'm at work." "Aria, sweetheart, you have to listen to me." His voice was frantic, the sound of wind whistling in the background. He was outside, likely at the docks again. "I'm in deep this time. The debt, the interest. It's not the small-time collectors anymore, it's them." Aria's blood turned to ice. "The Volkovs?" "The ghost is out, Aria. Viktor Volkov. He was released this morning. They say he's cleaning house. If I don't have the first installment by tonight, I'm a dead man. They'll come for you too." "How much, Dad?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be more than her life was worth. 500,000, just for the first week. Aria disconnected the call without saying goodbye. Her hands, usually so steady, were trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the table. 500,000. She looked around the library, at the priceless books and the ancient history. She was surrounded by millions of dollars worth of paper, yet she couldn't afford her own father's life. She walked to the back of the archives, past the restricted section to a small, nondescript locker. From the bottom, hidden beneath a stack of restoration supplies, she pulled out a box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Inside were the letters. For 2 years, this had been her secret sin. It had started as a desperate gamble, a way to humanize her father's debt to the man who sat at the top of the criminal food chain. She had written to Viktor Volkov while he sat in a maximum security cell, awaiting an appeal that everyone said was impossible. She hadn't signed them with her name. She had become Luna. In the letters, Aria wasn't a shy librarian with a broken father and a mountain of anxiety. Luna was a siren. Luna was a woman of fire and intellect, someone who could challenge a monster like Viktor with words alone. She wrote to him about the philosophy of power, about the beauty of the stars he couldn't see, and about the darkness that lived inside them both. She had meant to manipulate him. She had meant to make him merciful. But somewhere along the lines had blurred. Victor's replies, written in a sharp, authoritative hand, had become her lifeline. He didn't write like a thug. He wrote like a king, in exile. He told her things he'd never told his soldiers. He told her that her words were the only thing keeping the walls from crushing him. And now, the king was free. Aria pulled out the last letter he had sent, dated 2 months ago. Luna, the lawyers tell me the sun is within my reach. They think I am coming out to reclaim a throne of blood. Perhaps they are right. But every time I close my eyes in this cage, I don't see the city I lost. I see the woman I have never met. Do not stop writing. Your silence is the only thing that can truly kill me. V. Aria let out a shaky breath. She had stopped writing the moment the rumors of his release became reality. Panic had seized her. The fantasy was over. The monster was no longer behind bars. He was a predator in the wild, and she was a girl who had played with fire for far too long. She looked at the newspaper on a nearby desk. The headlines stared back at her. The ghost returns. Volkov acquitted. The image below the headline showed a man stepping into a black SUV. He was tall, his frame broader than any man had a right to be. His suit was charcoal grey, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. His face was a masterpiece of cold, sharp angles, and his eyes, even in a grainy photograph, his eyes looked like they could see through the paper and into her soul. "What have I done?" she whispered. Suddenly, the heavy iron doors at the front of the library groaned open. This was a private archive. No one came here without an appointment. Aria stood up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved to the edge of the stacks, peering through the gap between 2 shelves of leather-bound books. A group of men entered. They didn't walk like scholars. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace. They wore black suits that cost more than Aria's yearly salary, their eyes scanning the room with the efficiency of sharks. And then he stepped through. The air in the library seemed to vanish. Viktor Volkov didn't just enter a room, he owned it. He stood in the center of the marble floor, his head tilted back as he inhaled the scent of the books. "The smell of old secrets," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in Aria's very bones. It was the voice from her dreams, the voice she had imagined every time she read his letters. "Boss," one of the men said, stepping forward. "The records say this is where she works. Aria Rossi, daughter of the gambler." Victor didn't look at the man. He walked toward the stacks, directly toward the spot where Aria was hiding. "No," Victor murmured, his eyes tracking the rows of books. "I don't care about the daughter of a gambler. I'm looking for someone else." He stopped at the end of the aisle where Aria stood, her back pressed against the cold metal shelf. She was paralyzed, her breath held so tight it hurt. "I know you're here," Victor said, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "I spent 2 years memorizing the rhythm of your thoughts on paper. I know the scent of the ink you use. I know the way you pause before you write a lie." Aria closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. Victor stepped around the corner. He was even larger in person. He towered over her, his presence an overwhelming physical weight. He looked down at her oversized glasses, her messy bun, her trembling hands. Aria looked up, trapped between the books and the devil. Victor reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't strike her. He simply tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing her jawline. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle, but his eyes were a storm of dark intent. "You look different than I imagined, Luna," he said, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Smaller, softer, more fragile." I don't know who you're talking about," she lied, her voice cracking. Victor's eyes darkened. a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He leaned in, pinning her against the shelf with the sheer heat of his body. "Rule number 1 of our new arrangement, Aria," he whispered against her ear, his breath hot and dangerous. "Never lie to me. I've read your soul. I know exactly who you are. And now I've come to collect what is mine." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "Your father owes me a debt he can never pay. But you owe me something much more valuable. You owe me the woman who promised me her loyalty in the dark." Aria looked at the man she had spent 2 years taming with words. She realized then that she hadn't tamed anything. She had simply invited the wolf to her door, and now the door was wide open. "Come," Viktor said, grabbing her hand. His grip was firm, absolute. "Your life in the shadows is over. Today, you move into the light. My light." As he led her out of the sanctuary of the library and into the waiting black car, Aria knew one thing for certain. The story she had written was no longer hers to control. Viktor Volkov was the author now, and he intended to write a masterpiece in blood and silk. The interior of the black SUV felt like a high-tech tomb. The windows were tinted so heavily that the vibrant, chaotic streets of the city were reduced to a grey, flickering ghost of reality. Aria sat pressed against the leather door, as far from Viktor as the cabin allowed, her small frame trembling under the weight of the silence. Viktor didn't look at her. He was busy on a secure tablet, his large fingers moving with a precision that was at odds with the raw power he radiated. He looked like a man who had never been away, as if the 5 years of prison were nothing more than a minor business trip. "You're shaking," Viktor said, his eyes still fixed on the screen. Aria gripped her purse, her knuckles white. "You kidnapped me from my job. My manager. The police." "Your manager has been informed that you've taken an indefinite sabbatical for medical reasons," Viktor replied calmly. He finally set the tablet aside and turned his head. His gaze was a physical weight, pressing against her chest. "As for the police, they do not interfere in the private affairs of the Volkov family. You are safe, Aria, as long as you remember who you belong to." "I don't belong to anyone," she whispered, a spark of the fire from her letters finally igniting in her eyes. Viktor's lips quirked, a ghost of a smile that didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. "That's the Luna I remember. Brave, defiant, foolish." The car slowed as it approached a monolith of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, the Volkov Tower. The gates opened like the jaws of a great beast, swallowing the car into a private underground garage. When the door opened, Viktor stepped out first and reached back for her. He didn't wait for her to take his hand. He simply closed his fingers around her wrist and pulled her out. His touch was warm, firm, and utterly inescapable. They took a private elevator that rose so fast Aria's ears popped. When the doors slid open, she gasped. The penthouse was a cathedral of modern excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the skyline, making it feel as though they were floating above the world. The floors were black marble, polished to a mirror finish, and the furniture was a minimalist blend of Italian leather and chrome. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. "This is your home now," Viktor said, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it onto a sofa. He began unbuttoning his cuffs, revealing the dark ink of tattoos that crawled up his forearms, vines, thorns, and ancient Slavic symbols. "I can't stay here," Aria said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I have a life. I have my books, my apartment." "Your apartment is a fire hazard in a neighborhood that smells of rot," Viktor countered, walking toward a wet bar. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. "And your books? I've already had the rare editions from your personal collection moved to the library down the hall. The rest was trash. Aria felt a surge of indignation. You went into my home. Viktor took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. I own your home, Aria. I bought the building an hour ago, along with your father's debt. He walked toward her, each step measured and predatory. Aria backed up until her heels hit the glass window. The city lights twinkled hundreds of feet below her, but the danger in front of her was far more imminent. Viktor stopped inches from her. He was so tall she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, she could see a faint scar running through his eyebrow, and the scent of him, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something dark like a forest after a storm, overwhelmed her senses. Let's talk about the debt, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. Your father owes me 500,000 for the first installment, 10 million in total. He spent it on cards, horses, and bad luck. In my world, 10 million buys a lot of lives. He's an old man, Viktor. He's sick, Aria pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. He's a thief who stole from a man who doesn't forgive, Viktor snapped. He reached out, his thumb catching a tear before it could fall. His touch softened just for a second. But he gave me one thing of value. He gave me a way to find you. He leaned down, his face so close she could see the flecks of gold in his obsidian eyes. I spent 2 years in a cell with nothing but your letters, Luna. I memorized the curves of your handwriting. I lived for the way you described the world. You were my light in the dark. And then you went silent. I was afraid, she whispered. You should have been, he agreed. Because when I was released, I didn't want the money. I didn't want the territory. I wanted the woman who dared to play with the heart of a monster. He backed away slightly, giving her room to breathe, but the air still felt thin. The rules of our arrangement are simple, Aria. Rule number 1, you do not leave this penthouse without my permission. My security team is everywhere. If you try to run, I will find you, and the consequences for your father will be permanent. Aria swallowed hard, the reality of her cage settling in. Rule number 2, Viktor continued. You will dine with me every evening. You will talk to me. You will be the woman from the letters, the sharp, brilliant mind that kept me sane. No more hiding behind those oversized sweaters and bowed heads. And rule number 3, Aria asked, her voice trembling. Viktor's gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a terrifying second she thought he would kiss her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a ring, a massive, emerald-cut diamond flanked by 2 black sapphires. It was a brand, not a piece of jewelry. Rule number 3, you will wear this. To the world, you are my fiancé, my stability, my redemption. You will attend the gala on Friday by my side. If the commission sees that I am settled, they will leave my business alone. A fake marriage? Aria asked. A very real contract, Viktor corrected. He took her hand. His fingers were calloused, the hand of a man who knew how to use a weapon. But he slid the ring onto her finger with surprising delicacy. It was heavy, a cold weight that felt like a shackle. Is that all? Aria asked, her voice brittle. I'm just an ornament for your reputation. Viktor stepped back into her space, his hands sliding up to cup the back of her neck. He pulled her forward just enough so their foreheads touched. No, Aria, you're not an ornament. You're the payment. You'll live here. You'll sleep in my bed. No, Aria gasped, trying to pull away. Viktor's grip tightened, not to hurt her, but to anchor her. I am a man of my word, Luna. I will not touch you unless you ask me to. But you will be there. I spent 5 years sleeping on a concrete slab. I want to wake up next to something soft, something real. He let her go and walked towards the master suite. At the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "There is a wardrobe full of clothes in your room. Burn that sweater, Aria. I want to see the woman who wrote those letters. I want to see the fire." He disappeared into the room, the heavy door closing with a finality that echoed through the penthouse. Aria stood alone by the window, the diamond on her finger catching the light of the moon. She looked out at the city, at the freedom she had lost. She was no longer a restorer of history. She was a part of Viktor Volkov's dark future. She walked down the hall to the guest wing, finding a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment. On the bed lay a silk slip dress the color of spilled wine. Next to it was a note in Viktor's sharp handwriting. "I remember you wrote that red was the color of courage. Prove it." Aria picked up the dress, the silk cool against her skin. She looked in the mirror, seeing the girl with the messy bun and the frightened eyes. Slowly, she began to take down her hair, letting the dark waves fall over her shoulders. She wasn't Luna yet, but as she looked at the ring on her finger, she realized that in Viktor's world, you either became the predator or you remained the prey. She changed into the red dress. It fit perfectly, hugging her curves and exposing the pale skin of her shoulders. She looked like a different person. She looked like a woman who could survive a monster. A knock sounded at the door. It was one of Viktor's men. "The boss is waiting in the dining room, Miss Rossi." Aria took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and walked out. The dining table was a long slab of dark wood, lit by dozens of candles. Viktor sat at the head, already changed into a black dress shirt, the top buttons undone. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, Aria saw a flash of something other than ice in his eyes. It was hunger. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair at his right. The meal was silent at first, a parade of exquisite courses that Aria could barely taste. Viktor watched her with the intensity of a scientist observing a rare specimen. "Tell me about the 16th century diary," he said suddenly. Aria blinked. "What?" "The diary you were working on today. You told me once that history is just a series of lies we agree upon. What was the lie in that diary?" Aria hesitated, then began to speak. She talked about the charred edges, the hidden messages in the margins, and the woman who had risked everything to write her truth in a time when she was meant to be silent. As she spoke, she forgot she was a prisoner. She forgot the guards and the debt. She became the woman from the letters, passionate, articulate, and fierce. Viktor leaned back, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You see," he murmured when she finally paused. "That is why I brought you here. The world is full of beautiful faces, Aria. But your mind is the only one I want to own." "You can't own a mind, Viktor," she said, her voice stronger now. "Maybe not," he said, standing up and walking toward her. He stopped behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. The heat of him was intoxicating. "But I can provide the cage that keeps it safe." He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Sleep well, Aria. Tomorrow we begin the restoration of the Volkov Empire, and you will be right by my side." He left the room, leaving Aria in the candlelight. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She was a bird in a gilded cage, but as she gripped the edge of the table, she knew she wouldn't just sit on the perch. If Viktor wanted the fire, she would give it to him, but she would make sure he knew that fire didn't just provide light. It burned. The Friday of the Volkov Foundation Gala arrived with the weight of an impending storm. The penthouse was no longer a silent sanctuary. It had been transformed into a battlefield of preparation. Stylists, tailors, and makeup artists swarmed the guest wing, carrying garment bags that rustled like dry leaves, and kits of cosmetics that smelled of chemicals and roses. Aria sat in front of the vanity, feeling like a doll being prepped for a morbid display. Viktor had sent over a gown that defied logic. It was made of midnight blue velvet so deep it looked black in the shadows, with a neckline that plunged into a daring V and a back that was entirely open, held together by delicate diamond chains that mimicked the structure of a spine. "Shoulders back, Miss Rossi," the lead stylist murmured, applying a dark, blood-red stain to Aria's lips. "You are not just a guest. You are the statement." When the final brushstroke was laid, Aria stood. She didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Gone was the mousy restorer of ancient texts. In her place was a creature of ice and shadow, her dark hair pinned up in an intricate, regal knot, and the heavy emerald-cut diamond flashing on her finger like a beacon of her captivity. A knock at the door signaled his arrival. Viktor stepped in, and the stylists scrambled to clear a path. He was in a black tuxedo, his white shirt crisp and stark against the tanned skin of his neck. He looked lethal. He looked like the king he was born to be. He stopped, his eyes raking over her with a slow, deliberate intensity that made Aria's skin prickle. He walked toward her, dismissing the staff with a flick of his wrist. When they were alone, he reached out, his gloved hand tracing the diamond chain at the base of her neck. "Exquisite," he whispered. "You look like a secret worth killing for." "I feel like a target," Aria replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "You are a Volkov now," Viktor said, his thumb brushing her lower lip, nearly smearing the red stain. "To be a target is a privilege. It means you have something everyone else wants. Tonight, remember the letters. Remember the fire. My enemies will look for a weakness in you. Show them only a blade." The gala was held at the Grand Regency, a palace of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. As they stepped out of the armoured limousine, a wall of camera flashes erupted. The press was hungry. The world wanted to see the man who had cheated a 20-year sentence, and they were starving for the mystery woman on his arm. Viktor didn't shield her. He placed a possessive hand on the small of her back, his palm hot against her bare skin, and led her through the gauntlet. He moved with a terrifying confidence, nodding to senators and tech moguls as if they were nothing more than street vendors. Inside the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne. But beneath the surface, Aria felt the venom. Every smile directed at Viktor was a mask for fear or hatred. Every glance toward her was a calculation. "Viktor, my boy." An older man with silver hair and a face like a weathered hawk approached. His suit was old-fashioned, and his eyes were as sharp as obsidian. "Uncle Mikhail," Viktor said, his voice turning into a low, dangerous purr. He didn't hug the man. He stood like a statue. "I heard you were enjoying retirement in the Mediterranean. What brought you back to the cold?" "Rumors of a resurrection," Mikhail replied, his gaze sliding to Aria. He took her hand, his skin feeling like dry parchment. "And rumors of a distractingly beautiful anchor. So, this is the girl who tamed the ghost?" "She didn't tame me," Viktor said, tightening his grip on Aria's waist. "She reminded me why the world deserves to burn." Mikhail laughed, but the sound was empty. "Careful, Viktor. Anchors can keep a ship steady, or they can drag it to the bottom of the sea. Does she know about the Bratva Commission's vote on Monday? Does she know she's the only reason you're allowed to stand in this room?" Aria felt Viktor's muscles go rigid. She knows everything she needs to know. As Mikhail moved away, Aria leaned closer to Viktor. What was he talking about? What vote? Viktor led her toward a quieter corner, near a balcony overlooking the city. "The commission doesn't believe I am fit to lead. They think 5 years in a cage made me soft. They think I am a liability. If I am seen as a stable, family-oriented leader, a man with a wife and a future, they will vote to restore my territories. If not, they kill you, Aria finished for him. They try, Viktor corrected. The night progressed into a blur of introductions and hollow pleasantries. Aria played her part to perfection. She spoke of history, of art, and of the romance that had supposedly blossomed through the prison walls. She was sharp, witty, and cold enough to command respect. But then she saw him. Across the room, standing near the bar, was a man in a navy suit. He was younger than the others, his face handsome but marred by a cruel, arrogant sneer. Aria's heart stopped. Nikolai Volkov, Viktor's younger brother. Nikolai had been the one to visit her father. He had been the one to break her father's fingers to ensure Aria followed Viktor's instructions. "I need to go to the powder room," Aria whispered, her face turning pale. Viktor followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted his brother. "Stay away from him, Aria. Nikolai is a dog who doesn't know his master has returned." "I just need a moment," she pleaded. Viktor let her go, but his eyes followed her every step. Aria didn't go to the powder room. She stepped out onto the balcony, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. She gripped the stone railing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The diamond on her finger felt like lead. She wasn't a partner, she was a political move. She was a shield for a man who lived in a world of monsters. "It's a long drop," a voice drawled from the shadows. Aria spun around. Nikolai was leaning against the stone pillar, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You're Aria," he said, stepping into the light. "The librarian. You look much better in velvet than you did in that dusty archive. Did my brother tell you how much he paid for you? Or did he tell you he loves you?" "Leave me alone, Nikolai," Aria said, her voice trembling. "He's using you," Nikolai said, moving closer. He smelled of vodka and malice. "Monday morning, after the vote, you'll be discarded. Or worse. My brother doesn't keep things he doesn't need. Once he has his throne back, you're just a witness to his weakness." "Viktor wouldn't." "Viktor murdered our own father to take the crown," Nikolai hissed, pinning her against the railing. "Do you really think a girl who writes pretty letters means anything to him? Give me the ring, Aria. Walk away tonight, and I'll make sure your father lives. Stay, and you die with the ghost." Before Aria could respond, the glass doors shattered inward. A scream ripped through the ballroom. A group of men in tactical gear, faces hidden by balaclavas, burst through the service entrances. The sound of automatic gunfire erupted, tearing into the chandeliers and the gold leaf walls. "Down!" Viktor's voice roared above the chaos. Nikolai didn't try to save her. He scrambled for the far end of the balcony, disappearing into the darkness. Aria was left standing, a midnight blue target against the stone. She saw Viktor. He had pulled a handgun from beneath his tuxedo jacket, his movements fluid and lethal. He fired 3 times, each shot finding a mark. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a fiancé. He was the ghost, a phantom of death moving through the smoke. "Aria!" He reached her just as a bullet sparked against the stone railing inches from her head. He tackled her to the floor, shielding her body with his. Aria pressed her face into the silk of his lapel, the scent of his cologne mixing with the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder. "Stay behind me," he growled. He moved them with a terrifying efficiency, using the heavy stone pillars as cover. He fired back at the gunman, his face a mask of absolute, frozen calm. He didn't look scared. He looked like he was in his natural element. They reached the service stairs. Viktor kicked the door open, shoving Aria inside. "Go to the garage, level B. Look for the black SUV. Don't stop for anyone." "What about you?" she cried, grabbing his sleeve. Viktor looked at her, and for a split second the ice cracked. He leaned down, pressing a hard, frantic kiss to her lips. It tasted of salt and iron. "I have to finish this," he said. "If I don't kill them tonight, there is no Monday. Now run." Aria ran. She tore the midnight blue velvet as she sprinted down the stairs, her heels clicking like a countdown on the concrete. She reached level B, her lungs burning, her heart about to burst. The black SUV was there. The door opened and a man she recognized as Viktor's head of security, Lev, pulled her inside. "Where is the boss?" "He's still up there," Aria gasped. The car sped away, the tires screeching on the pavement. Aria looked back at the Grand Regency. Smoke was billowing from the top floors, and the sound of sirens filled the air. She sat in the back of the car, her hands covered in Viktor's blood, or perhaps the blood of his enemies. She looked at the ring on her finger. Nikolai's words echoed in her head. "He's using you." But as she remembered the way Viktor had shielded her, the way his heartbeat had thundered against her ear, she knew the truth was much more complicated. Viktor Volkov didn't just need her for a vote. He had turned her into a part of his soul, and, in his world, that was the most dangerous thing of all. She wasn't just a bird in a cage anymore, she was in the middle of a war. And as the car sped into the dark, Aria Rossi realized she didn't want to go back to the library. She wanted to be the blade he had asked for. To reach the target of 2,000 words for Chapter 4, while maintaining the intensity of a Mafia boss narrative, we will delve deep into the atmosphere of the commission meeting, the psychological warfare between Viktor and Nikolai, and Aria's internal transformation from a victim to a participant in this dark world. The dawn of Monday did not bring light. It brought a heavy, suffocating fog that swallowed the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Inside the Volkov penthouse, the air was thick with the scent of espresso and gun oil. Aria stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the grey mist swirl against the glass. She was dressed in a tailored suit of ivory silk, a colour of deceptive purity. On her finger, the emerald-cut diamond felt like a lead weight, a shackle she had grown to accept. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic click-slide of metal. Viktor was at the obsidian dining table, disassembling and cleaning his beretta with the focused devotion of a priest performing a ritual. He wasn't the man who had whispered poetry and letters anymore. He was the Mafia boss, a man of cold steel and lethal intent. "You don't have to do this, Aria," Viktor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that broke the silence. He didn't look up, but his hands never faltered in their mechanical dance. "The commission is a den of vipers. Once you walk in, the scent of your innocence will only make them hungrier." Aria turned, her gaze steady. "You told me once that the only way to survive a wolf is to show it your teeth. If I stay hidden, I am a liability. If I stand by your side, I am a statement." Viktor finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them, a testament to a night spent coordinating a silent war. He stood, moving with a predatory grace that made the room feel smaller. He walked toward her, stopping only when he was inches away. He reached out, his gloved thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Today, you are no longer a librarian, Aria. You are the woman of the Volkov family. If blood is spilled, you do not flinch. If a gun is drawn, you do not blink. You look at those 12 men, the butchers of this city, and you show them that you are the only thing the ghost cares about. And God help the man who thinks that makes me weak." The commission met in the vaulted basement of a deconsecrated cathedral in Little Italy. It was a place of ancient stone and modern sin. As Viktor and Aria walked through the heavy iron doors, the sound of their footsteps echoed like the ticking of a doomsday clock. 12 men sat around a massive oak table, their faces partially obscured by the flickering candlelight. These were the heads of the city's most powerful syndicates. men who had built empires on bones. At the head of the table sat Mikhail, the elder statesman of the Bratva, looking like a vulture in a bespoke suit. Next to him, leaning back with a smug, toxic grin, was Nikolai. "Viktor Volkov," Mikhail began, his voice dry as parchment. "You were given a chance to prove your stability. Instead, the Grand Regency is in ruins, and the police are breathing down our necks. You promised us a new era, yet you brought us a massacre." Viktor pulled out a chair for Aria with a terrifyingly calm deliberation. He sat next to her, draping an arm over the back of her chair in a gesture of absolute possession. "I didn't bring the massacre, Mikhail," Viktor replied, his voice echoing with authority. "I ended it. My enemies were so terrified of my return that they broke the sacred neutrality of the gala. That is not my failure. It is a testament to the fact that they know I am the only Mafia boss capable of holding this city's throat." "And the girl," a man from across the table sneered. "Aria Rossi, the daughter of a degenerate gambler. You expect us to believe that a man like the Ghost has been tamed by a mousy scholar?" Viktor's hand tightened on the back of Aria's chair. The air in the room grew cold, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees. "She didn't tame me," Viktor said, his voice dropping to a velvet whisper that carried more threat than a shout. "She reminded me that there are things in this world worth protecting with extreme violence. She is the keeper of my history. She has seen the darkness in my soul and didn't turn away. Can any of you say the same for your wives?" Nikolai laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "She's a hostage, Viktor, a pretty bird in a gilded cage. Tell us, Aria, did my brother tell you he'd erase your father if you didn't play along? Did he tell you that he's the one who ordered the hit on the docks last night?" Aria felt the weight of 12 stares. Predatory, judgmental, lethal. She looked at Viktor. For a split second, she saw the mask flicker. He was waiting. This was her trial. She stood up. The movement was sharp, pulling every eye in the room to her. "I am here because I am a Rossi," Aria said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "And a Rossi knows how to spot a bad bet. My father bet on his luck. But I am betting on the man who rebuilt an empire from a concrete cell while the rest of you were busy squabbling over his scraps." She looked directly at Nikolai, her eyes narrowing. "You speak of fear, Nikolai. But you were the first to run when the glass shattered at the gala. You left your blood behind to save your own skin. In my world, we call that a coward. In your world, I believe the penalty for a rat is death." The room erupted into a low murmur of shock. Viktor leaned back, a dark, satisfied smirk touching his lips. Nikolai's face turned a violent shade of purple, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "Enough!" Mikhail slammed his hand down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He looked at Viktor, then at Aria, a twisted sense of respect in his eyes. "The girl has iron in her blood. She is more of a Volkov than you, Nikolai." Mikhail turned back to Viktor. "The commission has reached a decision. The Ghost is back. The territories are yours, but—" He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like a predator's. "There is a blood price. The families who attacked the gala must be erased. Every man, every business, every trace. If you want the throne, Viktor, you must wash it in their blood tonight." As they walked out of the cathedral, the sky finally opened up, drenching the city in a cold, grey rain. Viktor led Aria to the armoured SUV, his grip on her arm unyielding. Once inside the soundproof cabin, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a pact. "You shouldn't have said that to Nikolai," Viktor said, though there was no anger in his voice. "He is a cornered animal now. He will strike tonight." "Let him," Aria replied, looking at her reflection in the dark window. "I'm done being the girl in the letters, Viktor. I'm done being Luna. If I am to be the wife of a Mafia boss, I need to know what happens when the lights go out. Viktor turned to her. He reached out and cupped the back of her neck, pulling her toward him until their foreheads touched. His eyes were no longer obsidian. They were a storm of dark fire. "Tonight the city will burn," he whispered against her lips. "I am going to show the commission why they call me the ghost. I am going to erase every name that stood against us. And you will stay by my side. You will see what it means to be a Volkov." "I'm not afraid," she lied, her heart thundering against her ribs. "You should be," Viktor murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, raw hunger. He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of rain, iron, and the finality of a death sentence. It was the kiss of a Mafia boss claiming his queen. And as the car sped through the rainy streets of New York, Aria realized she hadn't just saved her father's life. She had traded her soul for a seat at the right hand of the devil. The blood. Monday had only just begun. By midnight, the streets would be red, and the name Volkov would once again be whispered with a terror that would last for generations. The velvet darkness of Monday night was shattered not by the moon, but by the cold, rhythmic flashing of police sirens in the distance, a sound that Viktor ignored with the practiced indifference of a god. Inside the Volkov war room, a hidden bunker beneath the penthouse, the atmosphere was clinical. Large LED screens displayed blueprints of warehouses, docks, and residential estates belonging to the families who had sanctioned the Grand Regency attack. Viktor stood at the head of a steel table, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink of his brotherhood. He was no longer the man who wore bespoke suits. He was dressed in tactical black, a heavy leather holster strapped to his chest. He was the Mafia boss in his truest form, a commander of ghosts. "Aria," he said, not looking up from the maps. "Come here." Aria stepped out of the shadows. She was dressed in black silk and leather, her ivory suit from the morning discarded like a skin she had outgrown. She felt the weight of the silver-plated revolver Viktor had given her, tucked into the small of her back. "Tonight, the city learns the price of treason," Viktor said, his voice a low vibration. He pointed to a screen showing a reinforced estate in Westchester. "This is the Moretti stronghold. They led the charge at the gala. By dawn, this building will be a tomb. I want you at the command center. You will watch. You will learn how an empire is defended." "I don't want to watch people die, Viktor," Aria whispered, though the fire in her eyes contradicted her words. Viktor turned, grabbing her waist and pulling her flush against his tactical vest. The scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne was a dizzying mix. "In this world, Aria, there are those who pull the trigger and those who pretend the gun doesn't exist. You chose to be a Rossi. You chose to be a Volkov. There is no more room for pretense." The operation was a masterpiece of synchronized violence. Viktor didn't just send soldiers, he sent a message. Through the high-definition feeds, Aria watched the Volkov shadows move. They didn't use sirens. They didn't make noise. They moved through the Moretti estate like a virus. Silent breaches, suppressed muzzles, and the systematic erasure of every guard. Viktor stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. He watched the feeds with a terrifying stillness. Every time a red dot disappeared from the screen, signifying a kill, his grip on her shoulder tightened slightly. He wasn't just a Mafia boss. He was an artist of death. "Look at their faces, Aria," he murmured, pointing to a feed showing the Moretti patriarch pleading for his life before a suppressed shot silenced him. "That is what happens to men who think a contract is just paper. They thought my 5 years in prison made me a myth. Tonight, I am the only reality they have left." Aria felt a cold numbness spreading through her. She was watching the destruction of a dynasty in real time. She saw the blood on the screens, the cold efficiency of Viktor's men, and the absolute lack of remorse in the man standing next to her. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you need me to see this?" Viktor turned her to face him, his eyes obsidian and unreadable. "Because everyone else sees the ghost. They see the monster. I need you to see the man who has to be a monster so that you can live in a penthouse of glass and silk. If you love me, Aria, you must love the blood on my hands too." The night was nearly over when a frantic alert flashed on the main screen. Lev, Viktor's head of security, appeared on the comms. "Boss, we've located Nikolai. He wasn't at the cathedral. He's at the private airstrip in Teterboro. He's trying to catch a flight to Montenegro. He's taking the ledger with him, the one with the offshore accounts." Viktor's face went from cold to frozen. "Nikolai," he hissed. The name sounded like a curse. He looked at Aria. "Change of plans. The commander stays in the bunker. The Mafia boss goes to the field." "I'm coming with you," Aria said, her voice filled with a sudden, sharp resolve. Viktor narrowed his eyes. "It's a live extraction, Aria. It will be messy." "He broke my father's fingers, Viktor. He threatened me in the shadows. If he dies tonight, I want to be the last thing he sees." Viktor stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. A slow, dark smirk spread across his face, a look of pride that was more frightening than his anger. He reached out and grabbed a tactical jacket, throwing it to her. "Then move. We have 20 minutes before that plane leaves the tarmac." The airstrip was a desolate stretch of asphalt illuminated by harsh floodlights and the rhythmic strobing of the rain. Viktor's SUV tore through the perimeter fence, tires screaming as they skidded to a halt in front of a private Gulfstream jet. Nikolai was halfway up the stairs, 2 bodyguards flanking him. When he saw Viktor, he froze. The ledger clutched to his chest like a holy relic. Viktor stepped out of the car, Aria right behind him. He didn't draw his gun immediately. He walked toward the plane with a slow, deliberate pace that screamed of inevitable doom. "Nikolai," Viktor called out over the roar of the engines. "The air in Montenegro is cold this time of year. I think you'll find the ground in New Jersey much more accommodating." "Stay back, Viktor," Nikolai screamed, his voice cracking with terror. He pulled a compact pistol from his waistband. "I have the ledger. You kill me, and the commission loses every cent of the laundered money. They'll skin you alive." Viktor didn't stop walking. "The commission gave me their blessing to erase you, brother. The money is paper. My honor is blood." Nikolai's hand was shaking so violently, the gun was dancing in the air. He looked at Aria, his eyes wide with a desperate, toxic malice. You think he loves you. He's bringing you here to witness his sins so you can never testify against him. You're just an accomplice in a velvet dress." Aria stepped forward, moving past Viktor. She felt the cold rain on her face, the weight of the silver revolver in her hand. She felt the shadow of the Mafia boss behind her, her protector, her captor, her husband. "I'm not an accomplice, Nikolai," Aria said, her voice cold and absolute. "I'm the consequence." She drew the revolver. Viktor didn't stop her. He stood like a dark pillar, his eyes fixed on Nikolai. He was letting her take the shot. He was letting her cross the threshold into his world. Nikolai aimed at her, but he was too slow. Fear had made him clumsy. Crack. The sound of the shot was swallowed by the wind. Nikolai slumped against the railing of the jet, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. He tumbled down the stairs, the ledger falling into the puddles on the tarmac. Viktor moved then. He didn't run. He glided. He reached Nikolai in seconds, pinning his brother's head to the wet asphalt with his boot. He picked up the ledger and handed it to Lev without a word. He looked down at Nikolai, who was groaning in the rain. "You were always a bad gambler, Nikolai," Viktor whispered. "You bet against the ghost." Viktor pulled a knife from his belt, a long, serrated blade. He looked at Aria. "Turn around, Aria." "No," she said, her voice a hard line. "I'm a Volkov now. I don't turn away." Viktor's eyes flared with a dark, primal satisfaction. He leaned down and finished the work. The purge was complete. By the time they returned to the penthouse, the sun was beginning to rise, a pale, sickly yellow through the New York smog. Aria stood in the center of the living room, her hands stained with the ink of the ledger and the faint spray of the rain. She looked at the diamond on her finger. It didn't look like a shackle anymore. It looked like a crown. Viktor walked up behind her. He was covered in the grime of the night, his tactical vest discarded. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was hot, his heartbeat steady and slow. "It's done," he murmured against her neck. "The city is ours. The commission is silent." Aria leaned back into him, closing her eyes. She felt the darkness of the night settling into her bones. She had seen the erasure. She had pulled the trigger. She had watched the Mafia boss claim his throne in blood. "Is this it, Viktor?" she asked. "Is this the life we chose?" Viktor turned her around, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her with an intensity that felt like it could incinerate her. "This is the only life there is, Aria. The world is a cage, and we are the ones with the keys. You aren't Luna anymore, you're the fire that keeps the ghost alive." He kissed her then, a long, deep kiss that tasted of salt, iron, and victory. Aria didn't pull away. She leaned into the monster, realizing that in the ruins of the night, she had finally found where she belonged. She was the wife of a Mafia boss, and the world would never be safe again. The Blood Monday had left New York in a state of stunned, terrified silence. The headlines spoke of industrial accidents and gangland tragedies, but the streets knew better. The ghost had not just returned, he had performed an exorcism, wiping away the dissenters with a clinical coldness that made the other families tremble. Inside the Volkov penthouse, the air was different. The scent of ozone and gunpowder had been replaced by the fragrance of thousands of white lilies. Viktor's favorite flower for funerals, and, apparently, for victories. Aria stood in the center of the master suite, staring at the gown laid out on the bed. It was gold, not a bright celebratory gold, but the color of ancient coins found in a tomb. It was heavy silk, encrusted with bronze beadwork that looked like armor. "The coronation begins at 8, Viktor's voice drifted from the dressing room. He stepped out, fastening the links of a heavy gold watch. He was dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit, looking every bit the legitimate titan of industry, save for the predatory stillness in his eyes. He walked toward her, his gaze sweeping over the gold dress and then landing on Aria's face. "You look tired," he murmured, his thumb brushing the faint dark circles under her eyes. "I didn't sleep," Aria admitted, her voice brittle. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the rain at the airstrip. I see Nikolai." Viktor's expression didn't soften. He took her chin in his hand, forcing her to look at him. Nikolai chose his path. He bet against his blood, and he lost. Do not mourn a man who would have sold you to the Morettis for a percentage of a shipping route. I'm not mourning him, Viktor. I'm mourning the girl who used to think books were the most dangerous things in the world. Viktor leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers. That girl died the moment she picked up the silver revolver. To survive as the wife of a Mafia boss, you must realize that books only tell you about the world. Power allows you to rewrite it. Tonight, you aren't just my fiancé. You are the queen of the Volkov line. Put on the gold, Aria. Show them that you aren't afraid of the cost of your throne. The coronation didn't take place in a basement. It took place in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, which Viktor had rented out entirely. The security was a literal army. Men with earpieces and bulges under their jackets stood every 5 feet, their eyes scanning the crowd of the city's elite. As Viktor and Aria descended the grand staircase, the room went silent. It was a repeat of the gala, but the energy had shifted. The fear was no longer speculative, it was concrete. "Smile, Aria," Viktor whispered as they reached the bottom step. "They need to see that you enjoy the blood on our hands." The night was a choreographed display of fealty. One by one, the capos of the 5 families approached Viktor. They didn't shake his hand. They bowed their heads. They brought gifts, antiques, deeds to properties, and envelopes of cash, tributes to the man who had proven he was the apex predator. But while Viktor dealt with the men, Aria was led away by Mikhail's wife, Sophia, a woman whose face was so tight with plastic surgery it looked like a porcelain mask. "Come, dear," Sophia said, her voice like honey mixed with glass. "The men have their business. We have ours." Aria was led to a secluded lounge where the wives of the other bosses sat. They were draped in diamonds and fur, their eyes as sharp as the champagne flutes they held. This was the lioness den, where reputations were shredded and alliances were poisoned. "So," said Isabella Moretti, the widow of the man Viktor had erased on Monday. She was dressed in black lace, her eyes red-rimmed, but her voice steady. "The librarian who became a killer. Tell us, Aria, does the ghost sleep with his gun, or does he let you hold it for him?" The room went cold. The other women waited, their smiles frozen. Aria took a slow sip of her drink, feeling the weight of the gold silk against her skin. She thought of the library. She thought of the letters. And then she thought of the weight of the revolver in her hand at the airstrip. "Viktor doesn't need me to hold his gun," Aria said, her voice low and even. "He needs me to remember why he uses it. And as for your husband, Isabella, he should have spent less time worrying about Viktor's bed and more time worrying about his own perimeter." A gasp rippled through the lounge. Sophia chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "She has a tongue like a razor. Viktor chose well." "Choosing well and staying alive are 2 different things," Isabella hissed, leaning forward. "The commission only voted for him because they were afraid. Fear fades, but the grudge of a widow? That lasts forever." Aria stood up, towering over the sitting woman. "Then I suggest you find a very comfortable chair, Isabella, because as long as I am standing next to him, your grudge is just a ghost story." She walked away, her heart thundering. She had survived the lionesses, but she realized that the war wasn't just fought with bullets. It was fought in whispers and social slights. The climax of the evening was the swearing of the oath. Viktor stood on a raised platform, a silver chalice of wine in his hand. The 12 heads of the commission stood before him. "I am Viktor Volkov," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. "I have returned from the shadows to reclaim what is mine. My laws are simple. Loyalty is rewarded. Treason is erased. There will be no second chances. There will be no mercy for those who break the peace of the families." He took a knife, the same one he had used on Nikolai, and sliced his palm. He let the blood drip into the wine. "Who among you stands with the ghost?" One by one, the men stepped forward, performing the ritual of the blood bond. It was a barbaric, ancient ceremony masked by the elegance of the Plaza Hotel. It was the moment Viktor officially became the Mafia boss of bosses. When the ritual was over, Viktor looked at Aria. He beckoned her forward. "And here," Viktor said, his voice dropping to a velvet intimacy that made the crowd lean in, "is the woman who will carry the Volkov legacy. Aria Rossi is no longer a guest in this world. She is the foundation." He took her hand, the one wearing the emerald-cut diamond, and kissed it. The crowd erupted into applause, a sound that felt like the crashing of waves. Aria looked out at the sea of faces, the murderers, the thieves, the politicians, and realized that she was no longer an outsider. She was the centerpiece of a dark empire. The party lasted until dawn, but Viktor and Aria left before the final toasts were made. Back in the SUV, the silence was heavy with the weight of the crown. "You did well with the wives," Viktor said, leaning his head back against the seat. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes deeper than ever. "Sophia told me you put Isabella in her place." "She's dangerous, Viktor," Aria said, looking at the city lights. "She's not afraid of you." "Good," Viktor murmured. "A dangerous enemy keeps me sharp. A terrified one makes me lazy." He reached out and pulled her toward him, tucking her head under his chin. He smelled of lilies and blood. "Is it over?" she asked. "The killing?" Viktor was silent for a long moment. "In our world, Aria, the killing only stops when the heart does. But the war for the throne is over. Now begins the war to keep it." When they reached the penthouse, Viktor didn't go to the bar. He led Aria to the balcony. The sun was rising, painting the skyscrapers in shades of bruised purple and gold. "Look at them," Viktor said, gesturing to the city below. Millions of people, all living their little lives, oblivious to the fact that we decided who lived and died tonight. That is the true power of a mafia boss, Aria. We are the invisible hand. "And what happens when the hand gets tired?" Viktor turned her to face him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another box. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a pendant shaped like a phoenix, its eyes made of rubies. "A gift for the woman who rose from the ashes of the library," he said, fastening it around her neck. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "I have a secret for you, Aria. One I didn't write in the letters." "What is it?" "I didn't buy your father's debt to find you," he whispered. "I bought it to see if you were as strong as the woman you pretended to be on paper, and tonight you proved you are even stronger." Aria looked up at him, the monster she loved. She realized then that the letters hadn't been a trap for him. They had been a trap for her. He had seen her soul before she even knew she had one. "I'm not the woman I was," she said. "I know," Viktor said, a dark, primal smirk spreading across his face. "You're better. You're a Volkov." He kissed her then, a long, slow coronation of his own. And as the sun rose over the city, Aria Rossi realized that while the cage was made of gold and the throne was made of blood, she didn't want to leave. She was the fire in the ghost's dark world, and together they would make the city burn. To maintain the 30,000-word trajectory and ensure the narrative depth required for a high-stakes mafia boss story, Chapter 7 focuses on the resurgence of Aria's past and the brutal reality of how a syndicate handles loose ends. The golden glow of the coronation had faded, replaced by the clinical, grey reality of power. In the weeks following Viktor's official ascension, the penthouse had shifted from a gilded cage into a strategic command center. Aria was no longer just a guest. She had become the silent observer of the Volkov machinery, sitting in on meetings that decided the fate of shipping lanes, labor unions, and local politicians. However, the safety of the Volkov Tower was an illusion. In the world of a mafia boss, the past doesn't stay buried. It rots beneath the surface until it gashes the feet of those who walk over it. Aria sat in the library, the one Viktor had built for her, filled with the rare manuscripts he had rescued from her old life. She was attempting to restore a damaged ledger from the 1920s, but her hands were unsteady. On the desk lay a plain manila envelope that had been slipped under the front door of the tower, bypassing 3 layers of security. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of her at the Metropolitan Archive, taken months ago. But it wasn't the image that chilled her blood. It was the handwriting on the back. Some histories cannot be restored, Aria. They can only be paid for in full. You've been staring at that paper for 20 minutes. Viktor's voice was like a sudden frost. He stood at the entrance of the library, his coat draped over his arm, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of his brotherhood. He walked toward her, his eyes narrowing as he saw the tremor in her fingers. He reached out and snatched the photo from the desk. His face went from calm to lethal in a heartbeat. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It was at the front desk," Aria whispered. "Viktor, that handwriting. It's Julian." Julian Vane had been Aria's mentor at the archive, a man of quiet intellect and gentle hands. Or so she had thought. Before her father's debt had consumed her life, Julian had been the only person she trusted. But looking at the photo now, she realized Julian had known far more about her connection to the Volkovs than he had ever let on. Viktor threw the photo onto the desk and pulled out his phone. "Lev, I want a full sweep of the security footage from the lobby. Now. And find me a man named Julian Vane. I want his history, his bank accounts, and his current coordinates." He turned back to Aria, grabbing her waist and pulling her into his space. The scent of him, expensive tobacco and the metallic hint of a weapon, was the only thing that grounded her. "Why would he do this?" Aria asked, her voice cracking. "He was a historian, Viktor. He hated violence." "In my world, Aria, the most dangerous people aren't the ones carrying guns," Viktor said, his eyes obsidian. "They're the ones who carry secrets. If your mentor was watching you months ago, it means someone was paying him to keep a leash on the Rossi family long before I walked out of prison." "You think he's working for the commission?" "I think he's a loose end," Viktor growled, "and I don't leave loose ends." By midnight, the ghost had unraveled Julian Vane's life. Julian wasn't just a scholar, he was a cleaner for the Moretti family, a man who used the archive to launder stolen artifacts and forge historical documents for offshore tax havens. He had been the one to tip Nikolai off about Aria's letters. "He sold us out," Aria said, standing in the war room as Viktor studied the monitors. "Every word I wrote to you, he knew." Viktor looked at her, his expression a mask of cold fury. "He didn't just sell us out. He's the reason the Morettis knew exactly which balcony to target at the gala. He's the reason blood was spilled on our night." Viktor grabbed a heavy tactical coat. "Lev has tracked him to a safe house in the Ironbound district. He's preparing to flee. He has a hard drive with the original digital copies of my prison correspondence. If those letters get out, if the commission reads what I wrote to you, it proves I have a heart. And in this city, a heart is a death warrant." "I'm coming," Aria said, her voice hard. Viktor paused at the door. "No, this isn't a purge, Aria. This is an interrogation. It will be ugly." "He was my friend, Viktor. He used my trust to help Nikolai try to kill us. I'm not staying in this penthouse while you do the work." Viktor stared at her, a slow, dark smirk touching his lips. It was the look of a Mafia boss recognizing a fellow predator. "Then put on your boots, but remember, once we enter that house, Julian Vane isn't your mentor anymore. He's a target." The Ironbound safe house was a decaying brick tenement, surrounded by the skeletal remains of industrial warehouses. Rain lashed against the armored SUV as Viktor and his team moved with the synchronized silence of a shadow. They didn't breach the door with explosives. Viktor used a skeleton key, slipping inside like the ghost he was. Aria followed, the silver revolver heavy in her hand. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and desperation. They found Julian in a small room lit by the flickering glow of a laptop. He looked older, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who knew he was already dead. "Aria," Julian gasped, stumbling back against the desk. "You don't understand. The Morettis, they threatened my family. I had no choice." Viktor stepped into the light, his presence filling the cramped room like a suffocating shroud. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, his gaze clinical. "Choice is a luxury you forfeited when you placed a target on my wife's back," Viktor said, his voice a velvet death sentence. "Viktor, please." Julian turned to Aria, his hands shaking. "Aria, you know me. I taught you everything. I saved your father's job 12 times. You can't let him do this." Aria looked at the man who had been her mentor. She looked at the laptop. The screen showed a digital folder titled Luna. He was preparing to sell her most private thoughts to the highest bidder. He was preparing to use her soul to buy his own safety. "You taught me how to restore the past, Julian," Aria said, her voice sounding hollow and cold, even to her own ears. "But Viktor taught me how to protect the future. You didn't just sell letters. You sold us." Viktor moved then. It was a blur of violence, a hand around Julian's throat, slamming him against the brick wall. The sound of Julian's breath hitching was the only noise in the room. "Where is the physical backup?" Viktor hissed, his face inches from Julian's. I don't have it." "Nikolai took it," Julian wheezed. "Lie again," Viktor whispered, "and I will start with your fingers. The same ones you used to type those reports for Isabella Moretti." Aria watched as the Mafia boss performed his grim work. There was no emotion in Viktor's face, no anger, no joy. Just the cold efficiency of a man removing a cancer from his empire. She realized then that this was the foundation of her life. Her silk dresses and gold necklaces were paid for by this darkness. After 10 minutes of muffled screams and the sound of breaking bone, Julian broke. He pointed to a loose floorboard beneath the bed. Lev moved to retrieve a small, encrypted drive. "We have it, boss," Lev said. Viktor let Julian drop. The man slumped to the floor, a broken heap of a scholar. Viktor looked at Aria, his eyes searching hers for a sign of weakness. "Finish it, Lev," Viktor said, turning to walk away. "Wait," Aria said. Viktor stopped, his brow arching. "You want to show mercy, Aria, after he tried to hand your head to a widow?" Aria walked over to the laptop. She looked at the folder. She looked at Julian, who was sobbing on the floor. She took the silver revolver and fired, not at Julian, but at the laptop. The screen shattered, sparks flying in the dim room. "No mercy," Aria said, her voice a hard line. "But he doesn't deserve a quick death from a Volkov. Call the commission, Viktor. Tell them we found the Moretti spy. Let them handle him. That way, Isabella knows it was us who found her rat." Viktor's dark eyes flared with a primal, terrifying pride. He walked to her, wrapping a hand around the back of her neck and pulling her into a hard, sudden kiss. It tasted of salt and the cold finality of the night. "My queen," he murmured, "using the politics of the families to do the killing for us. You truly are a Volkov." The drive back to the penthouse was silent. Aria sat with the encrypted drive in her lap, the only remaining copy of the letters that had started it all. She felt a strange sense of closure. The girl who had written those letters was gone, replaced by someone who knew the weight of a gun and the price of a secret. When they reached the tower, Viktor led her to the balcony. The rain had stopped, and the city was a sea of shimmering lights. "Give it to me," Viktor said, gesturing to the drive. Aria handed it over. She watched as Viktor walked to a small metal basin he used for cigars. He dropped the drive in, poured a splash of high-proof whiskey over it, and flicked a gold lighter. The flame was bright and blue, consuming the plastic and metal, turning her letters, the Luna she had once been, into acrid smoke. "The past is gone, Aria," Viktor said, standing behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He was hot against her back, a living fortress. There are no more ghosts, no more mentors, no more scholars. There is only the family and the throne. Aria leaned back into him, watching the smoke drift away into the Manhattan night. She knew the peace would be temporary. Isabella Moretti was still out there, and the commission was always hungry. But as the Mafia boss tightened his grip on her, she knew she wasn't afraid. She had survived her past. Now, she was ready to burn the future. To maintain the 30,000-word trajectory and escalate the tension of your Mafia boss narrative, Chapter 8 plunges Aria into the heart of the enemy's territory. This chapter focuses on psychological warfare, the soft power of the underworld, and the moment Viktor realizes his bird has become a viper. The ashes of Julian Vane's betrayal had barely cooled before Viktor began planning his next move. In the world of a Mafia boss, a defensive stance is a slow death. To win the war against Isabella Moretti and the remnants of the dissenters, Viktor didn't need another purge. He needed a scalpel. "The Moretti women are meeting at the Sapphire Club tonight," Viktor said, his voice echoing in the cold, marble-clad war room. He was dressed in a black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattooed history of his violence. "It's a charity auction, a front for Isabella to gather the widows and the bitter. They're planning something, Aria. Something that doesn't involve bullets." Aria looked at her reflection in a nearby monitor. She was wearing a dress of midnight blue lace, fitted so tightly it felt like a second skin. Around her neck sat the ruby-eyed phoenix Viktor had given her. "You want me to go in?" she said, her voice a calm, steady line. Viktor walked to her, his presence an overwhelming force. He grabbed her waist, pulling her flush against him. "Isabella thinks you're a trophy. She thinks your fire was just a flash in the pan at the coronation. I want you to go in there, drink their champagne, and find out which families are secretly funneling money to the Moretti offshore accounts. You have the mind of an archivist, Aria. You see patterns where others see chaos. And if they recognize the viper in me?" Viktor leaned down, his lips brushing hers with a dark, possessive hunger. "Then you show them that a Volkov doesn't just bite. We consume." The Sapphire Club was a relic of old New York, a place of wood paneling, blue velvet, and the quiet, heavy atmosphere of generational wealth. It was the soft headquarters of the Moretti family, where the wives and daughters handled the laundry of their husbands' sins. As Aria stepped out of the black SUV, the cold night air bit at her shoulders. Lev and two other guards took their positions at the entrance, but inside she was alone. Viktor had insisted. A queen doesn't need a bodyguard among peers. She needs an audience. The ballroom was filled with the elite of the underworld. The scent of lilies and expensive gin was stifling. Aria moved through the crowd with a grace she had stolen from Viktor, her head held high, the emerald-cut diamond on her finger catching the light like a challenge. "The ghost's bride," a voice drawled. Isabella Moretti stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a court of grieving widows and sharp-eyed daughters. She was dressed in mourning black, but her eyes were twin daggers of ice. "Isabella," Aria said, nodding slightly. "I'm surprised to see you hosting an auction so soon. I thought you'd be occupied with the settlement of your husband's estate." A ripple of tension went through the circle. Isabella's jaw tightened, but she kept a porcelain smile in place. "The world doesn't stop for grief, Aria, though I suppose a librarian wouldn't know much about the endurance required for our life. Tell me, does Viktor let you out of the tower often, or are you only allowed to speak when he winds the key in your back?" Aria took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her movements slow and deliberate. "Viktor doesn't wind keys, Isabella. He opens doors. And as for my life before him, I spent my time restoring history. It's a useful skill when you're dealing with families who are trying to rewrite their own failures. Bold words for a woman whose father is still one bad hand away from a shallow grave, Isabella hissed, stepping closer. Aria didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a velvet whisper that only the inner circle could hear. My father is under the protection of the Mafia boss of this city. Your husband, on the other hand, is under 6 feet of dirt because he forgot who he was dealing with. Let's not talk about graves, Isabella. It's bad luck at a charity event. The auction began, but Aria wasn't interested in the jewelry or the art. She moved to the edges of the room, her eyes scanning the ledger at the bidder's table, her ears tuned to the low-frequency whispers of the women around her. She watched Sophia Mikhail, the commission elder's wife, huddle with the young widow of the Lucchese family. She saw the exchange of small, encrypted USB drives disguised as lipstick cases. She saw the way the money moved, donations that far exceeded the value of the items being sold. They're not laundering money, Aria realized, her mind racing through the patterns. They're pooling it. A war chest. Isabella isn't just seeking revenge, she's buying a vote in the next commission meeting. Just as Aria was preparing to slip away, she was cornered in the gallery by a man she hadn't expected to see. It was the Moretti's chief financial officer, a man named Marcus who had managed to survive the purge. "You're a long way from the archive, Miss Rossi," Marcus said, his voice greasy. "Isabella thinks you're a fool. I think you're a scout. Tell Viktor that the money is already gone. Even the ghost can't haunt a bank in the Caymans." "The ghost doesn't need to haunt the bank, Marcus," Aria said, looking at a painting of a dying saint. "He just needs to find the person who holds the key. And you look like you're having trouble sleeping." Marcus laughed, but it was a nervous, jagged sound. He looked around to see if Isabella was watching. "You think you're one of them. You're just a restorer, Aria. You fix broken things. But Viktor? Viktor breaks things that can't be fixed. One day he'll break you too." "If he does," Aria said, stepping into his space, her eyes turning into obsidian shards, "I'll make sure I'm the last thing he ever breaks. Now tell me about the Turchin account. Or do I have to tell Viktor you were the one who authorized the payment for the Grand Regency gunman?" Marcus's face went white. The bluff worked. I was forced. Nikolai had my family." "I don't care about your excuses," Aria cut him off. "I want the routing numbers. Now." Aria slipped out of the Sapphire Club 20 minutes later. The information burned into her memory. She didn't wait for Lev to open the car door. She was already inside, her chest heaving, the adrenaline finally crashing. When she reached the penthouse, Viktor was waiting by the elevator. He didn't ask how it went. He saw the fire in her eyes and the way her hands were gripped into fists. He led her to the war room, where he poured her a glass of whiskey. "Isabella is pooling a war chest," Aria said, the words tumbling out. "The auction was a front. Sophia Mikhail is involved. They're buying the Lucchese vote to challenge your seat on the commission. Marcus gave me the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. They're moving the money through a shell company called Turchin Logistics." Viktor stood still, a slow, dark smirk spreading across his face. It was the look of a Mafia boss who had just been handed the keys to his enemy's fortress. "Turchin Logistics," Viktor murmured. "That's a Russian-owned port in New Jersey. They're trying to bring in outside muscle." He walked to her, wrapping his hands around her waist and lifting her onto the steel table. He stood between her legs, his eyes dark with a primal, terrifying pride. "You didn't just find the money, Aria," he said, his voice a low growl. "You found the thread. If I pull it, the whole Moretti structure collapses." "I saw them, Viktor," she said, grabbing his silk lapels. "The way they looked at me, the way they looked at each other. They're not just afraid of you. They're afraid of us." "Good," Viktor whispered. He leaned in, his lips brushing the phoenix pendant at her throat. I told you that you look like a secret worth killing for. Tonight, you proved you're a weapon worth dying for. He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of whiskey, victory, and the dark finality of their union. Aria didn't pull away. She leaned into the Mafia boss, realizing that the viper's nest hadn't poisoned her. It had simply taught her how to strike. "What's the next move?" she asked against his lips. Viktor pulled back, his eyes gleaming with a lethal intent. "The next move is a funeral, but this time I'm not just sending flowers. I'm sending the check." As the monitors in the war room flickered with the routing numbers Aria had stolen, the city below continued to sleep, unaware that the ghost and his viper had just decided the fate of the next decade. The intelligence Aria had extracted from the Sapphire Club acted as a catalyst, accelerating the conflict from a cold war of whispers into a hot war of fire and lead. Turchin Logistics wasn't just a shell company, it was a jugular vein. By moving their war chest through the Jersey ports, the Moretti-Lucchese alliance was attempting to bypass Viktor's control of the city's financial arteries. But a mafia boss doesn't just cut a vein, he cauterizes the entire limb. The atmosphere in the Volkov penthouse was electric, gone were the white lilies and the pretense of civilian life. The floors were covered in tactical gear, and the hum of encrypted radios replaced the soft classical music Aria had grown used to. Viktor stood in the center of the chaos, a dark sun around which his soldiers orbited. "Teterboro was an appetizer, Aria," Viktor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as he checked the action on a customized submachine gun. He looked at her, his eyes obsidian and predatory. "Tonight, we take the port. If Isabella wants to buy a war, I will show her the cost of the ammunition." Aria stood by the obsidian table, dressed in tactical black, the ruby-eyed phoenix pendant hidden beneath her gear. She felt a strange, cold clarity. The archives were a dream. The blood on the tarmac was her reality. "I'm not staying in the bunker this time, Viktor," she said, her voice a hard, flat line. Viktor paused, his gaze raking over her. A year ago he would have laughed. 6 months ago he would have forbidden it. But tonight he simply walked to her, cupping the back of her neck with a gloved hand and pulling her into his heat. "The harbour is a slaughterhouse, Aria," he whispered against her forehead. "It won't be clean. It won't be poetic." "I don't need it to be poetic," she replied, looking up at the Mafia boss. "I need it to be finished." Viktor's lips twisted into a dark, prideful smirk. "Then take your position. You're with Lev in the Overwatch. You are my eyes in the dark." Port Turchin was a labyrinth of rust-coloured shipping containers and towering cranes that looked like skeletal giants against the moonless Jersey sky. The air tasted of salt, diesel, and impending death. Aria sat in the cramped darkness of a bird's nest, a rusted catwalk 3 stories above the main loading dock. Beside her, Lev adjusted the thermal scope on his rifle. Through her own binoculars, Aria saw the enemy. There were at least 30 men, Moretti loyalists and hired Russian muscle from the Turchin faction. They were offloading crates that Aria knew didn't contain electronics or auto parts. They contained the weaponry and the cash intended to fund Viktor's downfall. "Boss is in position," Lev whispered into his comms. Down on the tarmac, a single set of headlights cut through the fog. A lone black muscle car roared toward the gate, stopping just short of the perimeter. The door opened, and Viktor Volkov stepped out. He didn't take cover. He stood in the middle of the floodlights, a silhouette of absolute, terrifying confidence. He lit a cigarette, the ember a tiny, defiant spark in the gloom. "Isabella!" Viktor's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the harbour. "I know you're listening through the radios of these dead men. You thought you could bypass the ghost? You thought you could bring outside filth into my city? The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from behind the shipping containers, a rhythmic chug-chug-chug of automatic weapons. Viktor dove behind his car, but he wasn't retreating. He was the bait. "Initiate!" Viktor's voice crackled over the radio. The night exploded. Viktor's men, who had been ghosting through the water in silent rafts, breached the docks from the rear. Flashbangs turned the darkness into a blinding white void. Aria watched through her lens as the synchronized violence unfolded. It wasn't a battle. It was an industrial-scale execution. Viktor moved through the fog like a reaper. He didn't fire wildly. Each movement was precise. Each shot a period at the end of a sentence. He was the Mafia boss reclaiming his territory, one body at a time. "Aria, look at Crane 4, Lev muttered, his voice tense. Aria swung her binoculars. High above the chaos, a sniper was positioning himself on the arm of the crane, his rifle leveled at the back of Viktor's head. Viktor was pinned down by two Moretti guards, unaware of the threat from above. "I don't have the angle," Lev hissed, shifting his weight. "The support pillar is in the way." Aria didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the backup rifle resting against the railing, a weapon Viktor had taught her to use in the silent hours of the morning at his private range. "Aria, no," Lev started. She ignored him. She pressed the stock against her shoulder, feeling the cold bite of the metal. She adjusted the scope, the crosshairs dancing over the dark shape on the crane. She remembered Viktor's voice. "Don't fight the recoil. Become the recoil." She breathed out. The world slowed. The roar of the harbour faded into a dull hum. She saw the sniper's finger tighten on his trigger. She fired. The kickback bruised her shoulder, but she didn't look away. Through the scope, she saw the sniper jerk backward, his rifle spinning into the black water of the bay. He followed a second later, a dark shadow disappearing into the depths. Viktor spun around, alerted by the shot from above. He looked up toward the catwalk. Even through the smoke and the distance, Aria felt his gaze. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the viper he had created. The fighting lasted 40 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the harbour was a graveyard of Moretti ambitions. The war chest, millions in offshore bonds and illicit weaponry, lay scattered across the tarmac. Viktor stood over the Moretti commander, a man named Enzo, who had been Isabella's cousin. Enzo was bleeding from a gut wound, his eyes wide with the realization that the rumors of the ghost weren't exaggerated. "Where is she, Enzo?" Viktor asked, his voice a low, terrifying purr. He stepped on the man's wound, ignoring the scream that followed. "Where is Isabella?" She's not here," Enzo gasped. "She's at the estate. She knew this was a risk. She has a fallback." Viktor looked up as Aria and Lev descended the stairs from the catwalk. He watched Aria approach, her face smudged with soot, her eyes hard and dry. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his gloved fingers interlaced with hers. "You took the shot," Viktor said, his voice thick with a dark, primal pride. "He was going to kill you," Aria replied. Viktor pulled her into him, his tactical vest cold and hard against her. He kissed her deeply, the taste of salt and gunpowder between them. "I told you that you were a secret worth killing for. Tonight, you proved you are a weapon worth reigning with." He turned to his men. "Burn it, everything. I want the commission to see the smoke from their penthouses. I want them to know that the Turkin account is closed. Permanently." As the crates were doused in gasoline and the fire began to roar, Viktor led Aria back to the car. The orange glow of the flames reflected in the harbour, making the water look like a sea of blood. Back in the SUV, the silence was heavy. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the grim reality of what they had become. Viktor leaned his head back, his eyes closed. Enzo said she has a fallback, Aria said, looking at her bruised shoulder in the dim light of the cabin. Viktor opened his eyes. They were cold, reflecting the flickering fire outside. Isabella is a Moretti. They always have a fallback. Usually it's a suicide pact or a scorched earth policy. But she's forgotten one thing. What? Viktor reached out and took her hand, pressing the gold and ruby phoenix pendant against her palm. She's forgotten that I have you, and you are the only one who can navigate the history she's trying to hide. He looked at the burning harbour. Tonight, we destroyed her money. Tomorrow, we destroy her name. And once the name is gone, the Mafia boss doesn't even have to pull the trigger. The shadows will do it for me. As the SUV sped away from the Jersey docks, the harbour of ashes behind them, Aria Rossi realized that the library was gone forever. She wasn't restoring history anymore. She was writing it, in fire, in blood, and in the absolute shadow of the man she loved. The war for the city was entering its final, most lethal act, and the Viper was ready to strike. The smoke from the Port Turchin massacre had barely cleared before the commission called for a settlement of grievances. In the underworld, this was the most dangerous type of invitation. It was a summit of the 5 families, a forced ceasefire where everyone came armed with smiles and poisoned intent. Isabella Moretti, despite the loss of her war chest, had played her final political card. She had invoked the widow's right, demanding a public hearing before the commission to accuse Viktor of unnecessary savagery and the unauthorized destruction of shared assets. "It's a trap, Viktor," Aria said, standing in the center of the penthouse dressing room. Viktor was fastening a holster beneath his bespoke midnight blue blazer. He looked like a titan of industry, but his eyes were the cold, hard flint of a mafia boss preparing for an execution. "Of course it's a trap, Aria," Viktor replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He walked to her, his gaze raking over her outfit. He had chosen it himself. A floor-length gown of black silk with a high collar and long sleeves looking like a modern shroud. Around her neck, the ruby-eyed phoenix glowed like a drop of fresh blood. Isabella is a wounded animal. She knows she can't beat me with lead, so she's trying to beat me with the law of the families. "The commission is wavering," Aria noted, her mind shifting through the political patterns she had been studying for weeks. "Mikhail is being pressured by the smaller factions. They're afraid that if you can erase the Morettis so easily, you'll come for them next." Viktor grabbed her waist, pulling her into his space. The heat of him was the only thing that felt solid in a world of shadows. Let them be afraid. Fear is the only thing that keeps this city from tearing itself apart. Tonight, we don't go to defend ourselves. We go to claim the final piece of the board. He reached into a hidden compartment in his watchbox and pulled out 2 small obsidian rings. "Wear this on your right hand," he commanded. "The stone is hollowed. It contains a concentrated neurotoxin. If the toast is offered, and I give you the signal, you don't drink. You drop the stone into Isabella's glass." Aria looked at the ring, the weight of the choice settling in her chest. A mafia boss doesn't always need a gun, does he? "A gun is for soldiers, Aria," Viktor whispered, his lips brushing her ear. "Poison is for kings, and tonight we finish the Moretti line." The summit was held at Il Monastero, a private estate in the Hudson Valley that had served as neutral ground for the Mafia since the 1950s. The room was a relic of old-world power. Heavy velvet drapes, a massive oak table, and the smell of expensive cigars and ancient grudges. Mikhail sat at the head, his face a mask of weary authority. The other heads of the families sat in grim silence. Isabella Moretti stood at the far end, dressed in mourning lace, her eyes twin pits of obsidian hatred. As Viktor and Aria entered, the air in the room became electric. Viktor didn't bow. He didn't apologize. He walked to his seat with the slow, arrogant swagger of a man who already owned the room. He pulled out a chair for Aria, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "The ghost arrives," Mikhail said, his voice dry. "And his viper. Isabella, you have made your accusations. Speak." Isabella stepped forward, her voice trembling with a well-acted grief. "Viktor Volkov has broken every rule of the commission. He destroyed the Turkin port, a port that serviced all our families, simply to settle a personal vendetta. He has murdered my husband, my brother, and my cousins. He is not a leader. He is a madman who has been tainted by the common blood of a librarian." The men at the table murmured. Aria felt their eyes on her, calculating, cold, predatory. Viktor leaned back, a dark, amused smirk on his lips. "I destroyed the port because it was being used to bypass the Volkov tax. My laws were broken. Treason was committed. In the world of the Mafia boss, the penalty for treason isn't a stern talking to, it's erasure." "Enough of this!" Mikhail shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "The blood has reached the ceiling. The commission demands a peace. Viktor, you will compensate the Moretti estate. Isabella, you will drop the charges and accept the ghost as the supreme arbiter of the ports." Aria saw the flicker in Isabella's eyes. It wasn't relief. It was the look of a predator seeing the bait. "I accept," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a velvet whisper. "On one condition. We seal the peace with the toast of the five, as tradition dictates." Mikhail nodded. "Agreed. Bring the wine." 5 crystal glasses were brought forward. The wine was a deep, dark red, the color of a bruised heart. Aria watched as the glasses were poured. She felt the ring on her finger, the cold obsidian stone a reminder of the lethal secret she carried. She looked at Viktor. He was watching Isabella with a terrifying stillness. Isabella picked up her glass. "To the peace," she said, her eyes fixed on Aria. "And to the women who survive the men who build these empires." As everyone reached for their glasses, the room went quiet. Clink. Aria raised her glass. She saw Viktor's hand twitch, the signal. She moved with the grace of a woman who had been trained by the shadows. As she brushed past Isabella to embrace her as a fellow widow, her right hand swept over Isabella's glass. The obsidian stone opened with a silent click. The powder vanished into the red wine. "To survival," Aria whispered into Isabella's ear. They pulled apart. Isabella took a deep sip, a look of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the commission's peace would protect her long enough to plan her next strike. 10 seconds passed. The glass slipped from Isabella's fingers, shattering against the marble floor. She clutched her throat, her face turning a ghastly shade of blue. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords had already seized. "Isabella!" Mikhail stood up, reaching for her. Viktor didn't move. He sat in his chair, a silent statue of doom. "It seems the Moretti luck has finally run out," he said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "A heart attack. How tragic. The stress of the widow's rite must have been too much for her." The room descended into chaos. Doctors were called, but the neurotoxin was perfect. It mimicked a massive coronary failure, leaving no trace in a standard autopsy. Mikhail looked at Viktor, his eyes narrowing. He knew. They all knew. But in the world of the Mafia boss, if there was no evidence, there was only the reality of who was still standing. "The Moretti line is closed," Mikhail announced, his voice sounding hollow. "Viktor Volkov, the territories are yours. The grievance is settled." The drive back to the penthouse was the quietest of Aria's life. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. She looked at the ring on her finger. She had just killed a woman. Not with a gun in the heat of a harbour battle, but with a silent, clinical coldness that would have made Julian Vane weep. "You didn't flinch," Viktor said, his voice breaking the silence. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "She would have killed us both, Viktor," Aria said, looking at the city lights. "I did what the Queen of the Volkovs had to do." Viktor pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her like a living fortress. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent. "I told you that you were a weapon. Tonight, you became the sharpest one in my arsenal. I'm not a librarian anymore, am I?" Viktor pulled back, his eyes dark with a primal, possessive love. "No, Aria, you are the ghost's viper. You are the mother of the next dynasty, and the city is finally ours." When they reached the tower, Viktor led her to the balcony. The Hudson Valley was behind them. The glittering neon heart of New York lay at their feet. "Look at it, Aria," the Mafia boss whispered, gesturing to the millions of lights. "No more Morettis, no more Nikolai, no more shadows. We are the only thing left in the dark." Aria leaned back against his chest, the ruby-eyed phoenix glowing on her neck. She knew the peace was a lie. She knew there would be new enemies, new vipers and new blood. But as Viktor tightened his grip on her, she realized she didn't care. She had found her sanctuary in the heart of the storm. "So," Aria said, looking up at him, "what happens in Chapter 11? Viktor smiled, a dark, beautiful look that promised 1,000 years of sin. "In Chapter 11, we build the Empire, and we make sure the world never forgets the name Volkov." As the sun began to rise over the city of shadows, the ghost and his viper stood together, the undisputed rulers of the night. The silence that followed the fall of the Moretti family was not the peace of a resolved conflict. It was the eerie, pressurized quiet of a vacuum. Viktor Volkov had achieved what no Mafia boss before him had dared. He had unified the 5 families under a single, iron-fisted rule. New York was his. The ports, the unions, and the silent flow of offshore capital all hummed to the rhythm of his heartbeat. But in the world of the Volkovs, prosperity is merely a target for those who lurk in the global shadows. Aria stood in the center of the library, the morning sun casting long, golden fingers across the rare vellum manuscripts. She had traded her tactical gear for a dress of emerald silk, but the silver revolver remained tucked into a hidden drawer in her mahogany desk. She looked at her reflection in the glass of a bookcase. She looked radiant, powerful, and yet there was a new softness to her eyes that terrified her. She was 6 weeks pregnant. She hadn't told Viktor, not yet. She knew that the moment she uttered the words, the Mafia boss would turn the city into a fortress. He would lock her away in a cage of bulletproof glass and silent guards, and Aria had grown too fond of the hunt to return to being a bird. "You're hiding again." Viktor's voice drifted from the doorway. He was dressed in a grey charcoal suit, looking every bit the legitimate billionaire. Yet, the way he moved, the silent, lethal grace, was a constant reminder of the ghost. He walked to her, his gaze sweeping over her face with the intensity of a man who could read every line of her soul. "I'm not hiding," Aria said, forcing a smile. "I'm just organizing the chaos." Viktor walked behind her, his hands sliding around her waist. He pulled her back against his chest, his heat an overwhelming comfort. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on her reflection. "Something has changed," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. The air around you is different, Aria. You smell of lilies and secrets. It's just the city, Viktor. It's heavy lately. Viktor turned her around, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her with a terrifying tenderness. If the city is too heavy, I will burn it down until it is light enough for you to carry. Never forget that. He kissed her then, a slow, deep claim. But the moment was shattered by the harsh buzz of his encrypted phone. Viktor stepped away, his face instantly shifting into the mask of the Mafia boss. "Report!" he barked. Aria watched as his eyes narrowed into obsidian shards. "The Italians from the Camorra. In my harbour. No, do not engage. I want to see the face of the man who thinks he can bypass the Volkov tax. Bring the car." The expansion of the Volkov Empire had drawn the attention of the old world. The Camorra, the brutal, centuries-old syndicate from Naples, had seen the vacuum left by the Morettis as an opportunity. They didn't care about the Commission's peace. They cared about a foothold in the American drug trade. "They sent a messenger," Viktor said as they sped toward the docks in the armoured SUV. "A man named Marcello. He's young, arrogant, and he's currently holding 3 of my dock workers hostage in Warehouse 12. "Hostages?" Aria asked, her hand instinctively drifting to the emerald silk of her dress. "That's a provocation, not a negotiation." "Precisely," Viktor growled. "He wants to see if the ghost is a diplomat or a butcher. Tonight, I will show him I am both." Warehouse 12 was a cavernous space of rust and shadows, lit only by the rhythmic flashing of a broken neon sign. As they entered, the air tasted of salt and fear. 3 men were tied to chairs in the center of the room, their faces bruised, their eyes wide with the terror of men who knew they were pawns. Standing over them was Marcello. He was dressed in a loud, expensive suit, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked like a man who enjoyed the theatre of violence. "Viktor Volkov!" Marcello called out, his English accented and dripping with condescension. "The great American king. I expected more guards, more drama." Viktor stepped into the light, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of bored indifference. He didn't look at the hostages. He looked only at Marcello. "You're a long way from Naples, Marcello," Viktor said, his voice a velvet death sentence. "I assume your father didn't tell you that New York has a very low tolerance for tourists who don't pay the entry fee." Marcello laughed, gesturing to his own men, 6 shadowed figures armed with submachine guns. "My father told me you were a myth. A ghost. I wanted to see if a ghost could bleed." "A ghost doesn't bleed," Viktor whispered, taking a slow step forward. "He haunts. And tonight, I am going to haunt your family for a generation." Aria stood in the shadows, her mind racing. She saw the tactical layout. Viktor was the center of attention, drawing their fire, but the Camorra gunmen were positioned in a crossfire. If Viktor moved, he'd be shredded. She didn't wait for a signal. She moved through the stacks of shipping crates with the silence of the restorer she used to be. She reached the catwalk above the gunman, her silver revolver drawn. She looked down at Marcello. He was leaning in, a knife at the throat of one of the dock workers. He was performing for Viktor, trying to draw out a reaction. "You think this girl makes you strong," Marcello sneered, pointing to Aria's empty spot in the shadows. "I think she's a leash, and I've always found it's easier to kill a dog once you take away its owner." Viktor's face went from cold to volcanic. The air in the warehouse seemed to vibrate with his rage. "If you even utter her name again, I will not kill you. I will keep you alive in a basement until you forget what sunlight looks like." "Big words for a man in a crossfire," Marcello said, raising his hand to signal his men. Crack. The sound of Aria's shot echoed through the warehouse. The lead gunman on the left slumped over the railing, his weapon firing a useless spray of bullets into the ceiling as he fell. "Initiate!" Viktor roared. He moved with the speed of a lightning strike. He pulled a suppressed pistol from his waistband and fired 3 times in a single heartbeat. 2 gunmen fell before they could even level their sights. Aria didn't stop. She fired again, pinning the remaining shooters behind the crates. She wasn't a librarian. She wasn't a bird. She was the viper, protecting her nest. Viktor reached Marcello in seconds. He didn't shoot him. He tackled him, the force of the collision sending them crashing into a stack of wooden pallets. Viktor's hands were a blur of violence, punches that sounded like hammers hitting stone, followed by the sickening crunch of bone. He pinned Marcello to the floor, his knee on the man's throat. Viktor's face was a mask of primal, terrifying fury. "You threatened my wife," Viktor hissed, his voice a low, demonic growl. "Viktor, stop!" Aria cried, running down from the catwalk. Viktor froze, his fist cocked back for the final, lethal blow. He looked at her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The monster was fully awake. "He's a messenger, Viktor," Aria said, her voice shaking but firm. "If you kill him now, the Camorra sends a fleet. If you send him back broken, they send a tribute. Use your head, not your rage." Viktor stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The warehouse was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the surviving dock workers and the soft sobbing of the broken Marcello. Slowly, painfully, Viktor stood up. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression returning to the cold, clinical mask of the Mafia boss. "Lev!" Viktor barked. "Cut the workers loose. Give them each 50,000 for their trouble. As for Marcello, break his legs, both of them, and ship him back to Naples in a crate labelled defective goods." The drive back to the penthouse was the quietest of their lives. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, metallic taste in Aria's mouth. She looked at Viktor. He was staring out the window, his hand clenched into a fist on his lap. He was still vibrating with the need to kill. "You were going to do it," Aria said softly. "You were going to kill him right in front of me." "He threatened you, Aria," Viktor said, his voice raw. "I don't care about Naples. I don't care about the Camorra. If anyone thinks you are a vulnerability, I will erase them until the concept of threat no longer exists." Aria reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I'm not a vulnerability, Viktor. I'm your partner, and I'm the mother of your child." The SUV swerved as Viktor's hand jerked. He went completely still. The Mafia boss, the man who had erased families and defied the commission, looked at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart. "What?" he whispered. "I'm pregnant, Viktor." Viktor didn't speak. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest with a desperate, terrifying intensity. He buried his face in her hair, and for the first time, Aria felt a tremor in his hands. "A son," he murmured. "An heir." "Or a daughter," Aria countered, smiling through her tears. "Who will be even more dangerous than you?" Viktor pulled back, his eyes dark with a new kind of fire. It wasn't the fire of a purge. It was the fire of a dynasty. "I have to change everything," he said, his mind already racing through the tactical shifts required to protect a child. "The security, the alliances. I will build a wall around this city that the devil himself couldn't climb." "No, Viktor," Aria said, taking his face in her hands. "We don't build walls. We build a legacy. We teach them how to navigate the shadows, just like we do." When they reached the tower, Viktor didn't go to the war room. He led her to the balcony. The city was a sea of shimmering lights, beautiful and treacherous. "Look at it, Aria," the Mafia boss whispered, gesturing to the kingdom he had conquered. "This was all for us. But from now on, it's all for them." Aria leaned back against his chest, the emerald silk of her dress reflecting the moonlight. She knew the danger had just tripled. The Camorra wouldn't forget Marcello, and the commission would see a child as a new way to pressure the ghost. But as Viktor tightened his grip on her, his heartbeat steady and slow against her back, she knew they were ready. The ghost, the viper, and the heir. The story of the Volkovs was no longer a restoration of the past. It was a conquest of the future. And as the sun began to rise over the city of shadows, Aria Rossi realized that the library was truly 1,000,000 lifetimes ago. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The news of the Volkov heir did not travel through official channels. It spread like a slow-acting poison through the whispers of dressmakers, gynecologists, and high society florists. By the time Aria reached her 2nd month, the secret was no longer a secret. It was a strategic variable that changed the math of the entire New York underworld. Viktor had reacted exactly as Aria feared. The penthouse had been upgraded from a sanctuary to a fortress. New guards, men vetted by Viktor himself through blood and torture, stood at every corner. The glass was reinforced with high-impact polycarbonate. The food was tested for toxins, and Aria's movements were restricted to a 3-floor radius. "I am not a porcelain doll, Viktor," Aria said, her voice echoing in the cold, marble expanse of the dining room. Viktor was dressed in a black silk shirt, his sleeves rolled up, as he studied a series of intercepted communiques on his tablet. He didn't look up. He looked like a Mafia boss calculating the trajectory of a bullet. "To me, you are the only thing that matters," Viktor replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "To the rest of the world, you are a target with a timer. Until that child is born and the succession is secured, you are the most dangerous vulnerability I have ever possessed." Vulnerability. Aria stepped closer, the emerald silk of her maternity gown rustling. "I am the woman who took the shot at the harbour. I am the woman who poisoned Isabella's toast. I am not your weakness, Viktor. I am your spine." Viktor stood, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He walked to her, his hands sliding over her still flat stomach before resting on her hips. He pulled her into him, his heat an overwhelming, suffocating force. "You are both," he whispered, his lips brushing her temple. "And that is why I am losing my mind. Every shadow looks like an assassin. Every phone call sounds like a threat. I have spent my life as a ghost, Aria. I don't know how to protect something this precious." Despite Viktor's protests, Aria insisted on attending the annual Golden Rose Luncheon, the most exclusive gathering of Mafia wives and female power brokers in the tri-state area. "If I hide now," Aria had argued, "they will know I am afraid. And if they know the mother of the heir is afraid, they will strike the father." The luncheon was held at a private estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias and expensive gin. Sophia Mikhail, the elder wife of the commission, sat at the head of the long, lace-covered table. Beside her sat the younger, hungrier wives of the rising capos, women who saw Aria's pregnancy as a crack in the Volkov armor. "Aria, dear," Sophia said, her voice a polished blade. "We were so delighted to hear the news. A Volkov heir. It's been a generation since this city had a true prince." "Thank you, Sophia," Aria said, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. She felt the weight of 20 stares, eyes that were scanning her body for signs of fatigue, eyes that were calculating the value of her unborn child's life. "Though one must wonder," said Bianca, the sharp-featured wife of a rising Lucchese capo, "if the ghost is still the ghost when he's changing diapers. My husband says the docs have been quiet lately. Too quiet. Some say Viktor is distracted." The table went silent. It was a direct insult, a test of Aria's resolve. Aria set her glass down with a precise, cold click. She leaned forward, the ruby-eyed phoenix on her neck glowing in the afternoon sun. The docks are quiet, Bianca, because there is no one left brave enough to make noise. My husband is not distracted. He is focused. He is building a world where his child won't have to listen to the opinions of women whose husbands are one bad decision away from a shallow grave. Bianca's face went pale. Sophia Mikhail chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. She hasn't lost her bite, ladies. If anything, the mother instinct has made the viper more lethal. But as Aria left the luncheon, she felt the chill of a different kind of threat. It wasn't the verbal barbs of the wives. It was the way the security detail, men she didn't recognize, watched her. The dissent wasn't just in the social circles. It was in the blood. Back at the tower, Viktor was in the war room, but the atmosphere was explosive. Lev, his most trusted commander, stood at the door, his hand on his holster. "They're refusing to move the shipments through the Bronx, boss," Lev said, his voice tense. "The younger capos, Santi and Ricci, they say they're not getting a fair cut. They say the security tax for the air is draining their profits." Viktor was staring at a map of the city. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, the look a Mafia boss gives a dog before he puts it down. "They think I've gone soft because I'm a father," Viktor whispered. "They think the ghost has turned into a family man." "They're organizing a sit-down at the warehouse on 4th Street, Lev added. "They want to renegotiate the percentages, and they're bringing muscle from out of state." Viktor turned, his eyes obsidian and dead. "Renegotiate? In the Volkov family, we don't renegotiate. We dictate." Aria stepped into the room. "You can't go there alone, Viktor. It's an ambush." Viktor walked to her, his face a mask of cold stone. "I have to go, Aria. If I send Lev, it looks like I'm hiding behind my men. If I don't go, it looks like I'm hiding behind you. A Mafia boss who hides is already dead." "Then we go together," Aria said. "No." The word was absolute. "Not with the child." "Viktor, listen to me," Aria said, grabbing his silk lapels. "Santi and Ricci don't care about percentages. They care about optics. They want to see if you'll prioritize your legacy over your power. If we show up together, if we show them that the Volkovs are a united front, they'll lose their nerve. They're bullies, Viktor. They don't know how to handle a queen." Viktor stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. He reached out and touched her stomach, his hand trembling just a fraction. "If a single hair on your head is harmed, I will turn this city into a graveyard." "Then make sure you don't miss," she replied. The warehouse on 4th Street was a cavern of concrete and shadows, lit by a single, harsh floodlight in the center of the room. Santi and Ricci stood there surrounded by 20 men armed with heavy weaponry. They looked like men who had already won. When the heavy iron doors groaned open, they didn't see a fleet of SUVs. They saw 2 people. Viktor and Aria walked into the light. Viktor was in a black tuxedo, looking like an emperor. Aria was in her emerald silk, her head held high, the silver revolver visible in her hand. "Viktor," Santi called out, his voice echoing. "We were worried you wouldn't make it. We heard you were busy picking out nursery colors." Viktor didn't stop until he was 3 feet away. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood there, his presence an overwhelming, suffocating force. "I was busy deciding which of your territories I would be giving to Lev," Viktor said, his voice a velvet death sentence. Ricci stepped forward, his hand on his waist. "The old rules don't apply anymore, Ghost. We're the ones doing the work. We're the ones taking the risks. We want 50%, and we want the ports back." "And what do you offer in return?" Viktor asked. "Your life," Ricci sneered, "and the safety of your little family." The warehouse went silent. The threat was out. It was the ultimate sin in the world of the Mafia boss. Viktor didn't move, but Aria did. She stepped forward, the silver revolver leveled at Ricci's chest. "You talk about risk, Ricci. You're standing in a room full of men who are loyal to a paycheck. My husband is loyal to a bloodline. Do you think for a second that if you pull that trigger, any of these men will survive the next hour?" "She's bluffing," Santi said, though his voice wavered. "Is she?" Viktor asked, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper. Suddenly, the red dots of dozens of laser sights appeared on the chests of every man in the room. Viktor's snipers were in the rafters. Lev had breached the rear minutes ago. "This wasn't a sit-down," Viktor said, taking a step toward Ricci. "This was an audit, and you are both deep in the red." He moved with the speed of a cobra. He grabbed Ricci's arm, snapping the bone with a sickening crack, and shoved him to the floor. He pulled his own pistol and pressed the cold muzzle against Santi's forehead. "I am the ghost," Viktor hissed. "I built this city while you were still learning how to lie. If you ever mention my family again, I will not kill you. I will keep you alive in a cage and let my son watch you rot, so he knows what happens to a rat." Santi collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "Please, Viktor, we were misled." "Get out," Viktor commanded. "You have 1 hour to leave the city. Your businesses are gone. Your names are erased. If I see your faces again, the streets will be painted with your blood." The mutiny evaporated in seconds. The men scrambled for the exits, leaving Santi and Ricci broken on the concrete. The drive back was silent, but the air was heavy with the realization of what they had become. Aria sat with her hand on her stomach, her chest heaving. She had looked into the eyes of a mutiny and hadn't blinked. When they reached the penthouse, Viktor didn't go to the war room. He led Aria to the nursery, a room that was still empty, still being prepared. He sat on the floor, leaning his head against the wall, looking more human than he had in months. "They'll keep coming, won't they?" Aria asked, sitting beside him. "Yes," Viktor said, his voice tired. "A child is a light in the dark, Aria, and the dark hates the light. I thought I could protect you by hiding you. I was wrong. I have to protect you by making you the most feared woman in the world." "I think we started that tonight," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Viktor reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. "I am a Mafia boss, Aria. My hands are stained. My soul is black. But for this child, I will be whatever I have to be. I will be the monster that guards the gate." "And I'll be the one who sharpens the teeth," Aria replied. As the moon rose over the Volkov Tower, the sanctuary felt more like a kingdom than ever before. The mutiny was crushed, the social war was won, but the ghost and his viper knew that the real battle was just beginning. They were no longer just survivors. They were a dynasty, and the world was about to learn that a Volkov never sleeps. The 9th month of Aria's pregnancy arrived not with a whimper, but with the roar of a gathering storm. New York had become a pressure cooker. The Camorra from Naples had formed an unholy alliance with the remnants of the Moretti loyalists and a splinter faction of the Commission. They didn't want the ports anymore. They wanted the head of the ghost and the end of the Volkov bloodline. Viktor had turned the penthouse into a surgical fortress. An entire medical suite had been installed in the guest wing, staffed by doctors whose families were held in high-security safe houses to ensure absolute loyalty. Aria stood in the nursery, her hand resting on the dark walnut of the crib. She was dressed in a heavy silk robe, her movements slow and deliberate. The silver revolver was no longer in a drawer. It was in a holster strapped to her thigh, hidden beneath the silk. "The sensors on the perimeter just went dark," Viktor's voice crackled through her earpiece. He appeared in the doorway a second later. He was dressed in full tactical gear, his face a mask of cold, predatory focus. He looked like the Mafia boss of a world that was about to end. He walked to her, his hands, bruised from a late-night interrogation, sliding over her swollen stomach. It's tonight, Viktor whispered, his forehead resting against hers. They're not waiting for the hospital. They're coming to the tower. Then we give them the welcome they deserve, Aria replied, though a sharp, agonizing cramp suddenly shot through her abdomen. She gasped, gripping the edge of the crib. Viktor's eyes widened, a flash of pure human terror breaking through his mask. Aria? The timing, she panted, her face turning pale. The air has a flair for drama, Viktor. It's happening. Now. The first explosion rocked the Volkov Tower at 11:02 p.m. The elevator shafts were blown, cutting off the main access to the penthouse. But the predators didn't come from below. They came from the sky. Aria lay on the medical bed, the sharp staccato of automatic gunfire echoing through the reinforced walls. Viktor stood at the doorway of the suite, his submachine gun leveled at the hallway. Lev, Viktor barked into his comms. They're rappelling from the roof. Deploy the gas in the ventilation. I want them blind before they hit the floor. Push, Aria, the doctor urged, his forehead slick with sweat. He was a man who had stitched up 1,000 bullet wounds, but the birth of a Mafia prince in the middle of a siege was testing his sanity. Aria screamed, not from fear, but from the raw, primal agony of the moment. Outside, the sound of glass shattering rang out. The balcony had been breached. Viktor, Aria cried out. Viktor turned, his eyes meeting hers. In that split second, he wasn't the Mafia boss or the ghost. He was a man watching his world ignite. I am here, Aria. Focus on the child. I will handle the darkness. He stepped out into the hallway, and the world became a symphony of violence. Aria heard the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his weapon, the guttural screams of men who had made the mistake of entering the ghost's lair, and the cold, clinical commands he shouted to his guards. The siege was a slaughterhouse. The Camorra hitmen were elite, but they were fighting a man who had nothing left to lose. Viktor moved through the penthouse like a shadow made of lead. He used the black marble pillars as cover, his movements a blur of tactical precision. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his shirt soaked in a mixture of his blood and theirs. He reached the final barricade, the doors to the medical suite. 3 men in tactical gear burst through the kitchen, their muzzles flashing. Viktor didn't flinch. He dove through the air, firing mid-leap. 2 fell instantly. He tackled the third, his knife finding the gap in the man's armor with the terrifying accuracy of a surgeon. You think you can take my son? Viktor hissed into the dying man's ear. I will burn Naples to the ground for even thinking it. Inside the room, the struggle was of a different kind. Aria gripped the handles of the bed, her knuckles white. She could hear the fighting just inches away. She felt the heat of the gunfire through the door. One more push, Aria, the doctor shouted. With a final shattering cry, the room was filled with a new sound. It wasn't the crackle of a radio or the roar of a gun. It was the sharp, piercing wail of a newborn child. The sound of the baby's cry seemed to ripple through the penthouse, freezing the violence in its tracks. In the hallway, Viktor paused, his hand on the door handle, his chest heaving. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the fading echoes of sirens in the street below. Lev appeared at the end of the hall, his face covered in soot. Roof is clear, boss. We've neutralized the remaining teams. The towers are secure. Viktor didn't answer. He pushed open the door to the medical suite. He dropped his weapon. He stripped off his tactical vest, his hands shaking as he walked towards the bed. Aria was lying back, her hair damp with sweat, her face glowing with a fierce, exhausted pride. In her arms was a bundle of white linen. Viktor sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the child, a boy with a shock of dark hair and the same piercing obsidian eyes as his father. A son, Viktor whispered, his voice breaking. Viktor, Aria said, her voice a tired rasp. Meet your heir, Nikolai, in memory of the brother you lost and the man he should have been. Viktor reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over the infant's tiny fingers. The Mafia boss wept. It wasn't the weeping of a broken man, but the shedding of the ghost's skin. He was no longer just a predator, he was a progenitor. He leaned down and kissed Aria's forehead, then pressed his lips to the child's hand. I promise you, Viktor murmured, his voice returning to its low, authoritative rumble. The world I built in blood, I will maintain in steel. No one will ever touch you. No one will ever make you afraid. An hour later, the penthouse was being scrubbed of the night's sins. The bodies were gone, the glass was being replaced, and the smell of gunpowder was being masked by the scent of fresh lilies. Viktor stood by the window looking out at the city. He was holding the baby, the infant looking tiny against his broad shoulder. Aria sat in a chair nearby, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, watching them. The commission is calling, Lev said, stepping into the room with a tablet. They want to know if the heir survived the night. Viktor didn't look at the screen. Tell them the heir did more than survive. Tell them the ghost has a reason to stay in the light now. And tell them that if a single shipment is late, or a single cent is missing from the tribute, I won't send an army. I'll come myself. He turned to Aria, a slow, dark smirk touching his lips. It was the look of a man who had won the final war. The city thinks we are vulnerable now, Aria, Viktor said. Let them think it, Aria replied, looking at her son. It will make it easier to see them coming. As the sun began to rise over New York, painting the skyscrapers in shades of gold and crimson, the Volkov Tower stood tall, a monument to a love that had been forged in a prison cell and tempered in the fires of a Mafia war. The library was gone. The letters were ash. But as Aria looked at her husband and her son, she knew that this was the story she was always meant to write. A story of blood, silk, and the absolute power of the ghost. 5 years had passed since the night the Volkov Tower was baptized in crimson and silk. The scars on the marble floors had long been polished away, and the bullet holes in the Hudson Valley Cathedral were now hidden behind ornate gold leaf. New York had settled into an era of forced prosperity under the absolute reign of the ghost. But for Aria, the silence of the penthouse was louder than the sirens ever were. She stood in the center of the grand hallway, her emerald silk dress replaced by a structured suit of midnight navy. She was no longer just the Viper, she was the matriarch. She managed the Volkov legitimate foundations with a clinical efficiency that made the city's bankers tremble. Yet her eyes were constantly fixed on the small, dark figure at the end of the hall. Little Nikolai. At 5 years old, the boy was a chilling mirror of his father. He didn't play with toy soldiers. He watched the security monitors with a silent, eerie focus. He didn't cry when he fell. He simply stared at the blood on his knee as if analyzing a tactical error. "He's doing it again, Viktor," Aria said, her voice a low whisper as Viktor stepped into the hall. Viktor had aged like fine wine and cold steel. The grey at his temples only added to his gravitas as a Mafia boss. He walked to Aria, wrapping his large, scarred hand around her waist. He looked at his son. The boy was currently standing before a map of the world, tracing the shipping routes with a small, blunt finger. "He is a Volkov, Aria," Viktor replied, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "He is learning his inheritance. You cannot expect a lion to behave like a lamb just because you birthed him in a library." "He doesn't smile, Viktor," Aria said, turning to face him. "He watches the guards clean their weapons as if it's a religious rite. I wanted a future for him, not a reincarnation of the ghost." Viktor cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. The world is getting darker, my love. The shadows I fought to clear are creeping back. If he is not a ghost, he will be a victim. I will not let him be a victim. The following afternoon, the atmosphere in the tower shifted. A shipment of high-end electronics had been hijacked in Queens, a small provocation, but a deliberate test of Viktor's aging grip on the city. The perpetrator was a young, hot-headed associate of the Lucchese family who thought the family man version of the Volkovs had grown soft. Viktor didn't send a squad. He handled it at the private training facility in the basement of the tower. And he brought Nikolai. Aria stood behind the reinforced glass of the observation deck, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below, in the center of the sparring ring, stood Viktor and the captive thief. The thief was bruised, his hands tied behind his back. Nikolai sat on a high stool at the edge of the ring, his dark eyes wide, his expression unreadable. "Look at him, Nikolai," Viktor said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "This man took what belongs to us. He didn't do it for hunger. He did it for ego. What is the penalty for ego?" The 5-year-old didn't hesitate. "Erasure, father." The word felt like a physical blow to Aria. She leaned her forehead against the glass. "I did this," she thought. "I traded the archive for this." Viktor pulled a small, silver-handled pocket knife from his pocket. He didn't use it on the man. He handed it to Nikolai. "A gift," Viktor said. "Not for blood, for the memory. This is the weight of the crown, Nikolai. It is heavy, it is sharp, and it never leaves your hand." Viktor then signaled Lev to take the thief away. The erasure would happen elsewhere, out of the boy's sight, but the lesson had been seared into the child's mind. Power was a tool, and mercy was a luxury they didn't possess. That evening, the commission called for an emergency meeting. The old world was restless again. The Camorra had never forgotten the box labelled defective goods, and they had sent a new envoy, a man named Donato, a butcher who specialized in tearing down dynasties from the inside. "They want to talk about the succession, Aria," Viktor said as he knotted his tie in the mirror. He looked tired, not the exhaustion of a man who worked, but the weariness of a man who watched. "They think a 5-year-old heir makes us a target. They want me to name a regent from the commission in case I fall." "A regent?" Aria scoffed, fastening the ruby-eyed phoenix at her neck. "They want a leash. They want to control Nikolai before he's old enough to hold a gun." "They will fail," Viktor said, turning to her. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. The scent of him, sandalwood and cold iron, was the only thing that felt real. "But the social war is back. Tonight, you lead the lionesses again. Sofia Mikhail is wavering. The other wives are watching Nikolai like wolves watching a cub. Show them he is not a cub. Show them he is a prince." The reception was held at the Volkov estate in the Hamptons, a sprawling fortress of white stone and blue water. Aria walked through the crowd, her head held high, her hand resting on Nikolai's shoulder. The boy was dressed in a miniature black suit, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference that made the other wives whisper behind their fans. "He's so quiet," Bianca Lucchese said, sipping her champagne. Her husband was the one Viktor had humiliated 5 years ago. "Does he play at all, Aria, or does he just calculate the yield of the docks?" Aria smiled, but it was the smile of a viper. "He plays, Bianca, but he prefers chess to checkers. He finds that most people's moves are predictable." Sofia Mikhail approached, her face a map of wrinkles and cunning. "Aria, dear, Donato is here. He's been asking about the boy's education. He thinks the Volkov line needs European seasoning." Aria looked across the lawn. Donato was a massive man with a scarred neck and eyes that looked like they had been hollowed out by a drill. He was watching Nikolai with a hunger that made Aria's blood boil. Donato walked toward them, his presence a dark stain on the bright lawn. He leaned down toward Nikolai, reaching out a hand to pat the boy's head. A fine boy. A shame if he were to grow up in such a volatile environment. Nikolai didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply looked up at the giant man. "My father says people who reach for things that aren't theirs lose their hands," Nikolai said, his voice high but steady. The surrounding circle of wives gasped. Donato froze, his hand inches from the boy's hair. He looked at Aria, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. "He has your tongue, Punan, and his father's eyes. A dangerous combination." "He has the weight of the city behind him, Donato," Aria said, stepping between the man and her son. "I suggest you remember that before you offer any more seasoning." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the estate had returned to its pressurized silence, Aria sat by Nikolai's bed. The boy was finally asleep, his small hand still clutching the silver-handled knife Viktor had given him. Viktor stood in the doorway, his silhouette a dark pillar against the hallway light. "He did well tonight," Viktor said quietly. "He terrified them, Viktor," Aria replied. "He's 5 years old and he terrified a Neapolitan butcher. Is that what we wanted?" Viktor walked to the bed, looking down at his son. He reached out and stroked the boy's hair, his touch infinitely gentle. "I wanted him to be safe. In our world, fear is the only armor that never breaks." He looked at Aria, his eyes dark with a weary, possessive love. "The commission will vote on the regency tomorrow. They think they can take him from us. They don't realize that the ghost and the viper have already raised a monster of their own." Aria stood up and leaned against Viktor's chest. She looked at the moon reflecting off the Atlantic. The war for the city was no longer about ports or ledgers. It was about the soul of the child in the bed. She thought back to the library, to the girl who restored ancient history. She realized then that history wasn't something you restored. It was something you bled for. It was a cycle that never ended. "We won't let them take him," Aria whispered. "I will burn the world first," the Mafia boss promised. And as the waves crashed against the stone walls of the estate, Aria Rossi knew that the next chapter of the Volkov legacy would be the bloodiest one yet. Because the only thing more dangerous than a ghost was a boy who had been raised by one. This is the final chapter, the grand finale of the Mafia boss saga. To reach the 30,000-word milestone, this chapter is designed as a high-octane masterpiece of action, sacrifice, and the definitive birth of a new era. The air in New York on the day of the Regency vote was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of impending rain. The city felt as though it were holding its breath. The commission had summoned Viktor Volkov to the Cathedral of Shadows for the final time. The agenda was simple: the forced appointment of a regent to oversee the Volkov assets until Nikolai reached the age of 18. It was a death sentence disguised as a policy. Inside the Volkov Tower, Viktor stood at the center of the war room. He wasn't looking at maps or ledgers. He was staring at Nikolai. The boy was sitting on a steel crate, quietly sharpening the silver-handled pocket knife his father had given him. Aria entered, her heels clicking like the hammer of a gun on the marble floor. She was dressed in a suit of blood-red silk, the ruby-eyed phoenix on her neck shimmering in the dim light. She looked like a goddess of war. "The motorcade is ready," Aria said, her voice a cold, hard line. Viktor turned. He walked to her, his large hands cupping her face. His eyes were no longer obsidian. They were a weary, ancient grey. He kissed her forehead, then leaned down to look Nikolai in the eye. Today, you are the shadow behind the throne, Viktor told his son. If I do not walk out of that cathedral, you do not cry. You do not scream. You become the ghost. You find Lev, and you execute the final protocol. Do you understand? Nikolai stopped sharpening the blade. He looked at his father with a terrifying, stoic clarity. I understand, father. The world burns until the debt is paid. Viktor stood, his jaw tight. He looked at Aria, a silent farewell in his gaze. He didn't say I love you. He didn't have to. In the world of a mafia boss, possession is the highest form of love. The Cathedral of Shadows was more crowded than Aria had ever seen it. Every capo, every lieutenant, and every don of the tri-state area was present. They sat in the pews like vultures awaiting a feast. Mikhail stood at the altar, but beside him was the Neapolitan butcher, Donato. The alliance was clear. The old world and the new world had joined hands to decapitate the ghost. Viktor Volkov, Mikhail's voice boomed. The commission has found you unstable. Your focus is divided between your territory and your nursery. For the safety of the 5 families, we hereby appoint Donato as the regent of the Volkov line. Viktor walked to the center of the hall, alone. He didn't bring his guards inside. He left them at the perimeter, as per the sacred law of the neutral ground. He stood with his hands in his pockets, a dark sun in a room of dying stars. You speak of stability, Mikhail, Viktor said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. But you are standing next to a man who sells children in Naples. If you think I will hand my son's future to a scavenger, you have forgotten why you call me the ghost. It is not a request, Viktor. Nikolai, the boy's uncle and Viktor's long-dead brother's namesake, who had secretly survived and been harbored by the Camorra, stepped out from behind a pillar. Aria gasped from her seat in the gallery. Nikolai was alive? The betrayal ran deeper than she could have imagined. The vote is unanimous, the elder Nikolai hissed, his face scarred and twisted. Step down or be stepped on. Viktor didn't flinch. He looked up toward the gallery, meeting Aria's eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. The explosion didn't come from a bomb. It came from the skylight. Lev and a dozen Volkov elites shattered the glass, descending on silk ropes like spiders made of lead. At the same time, the heavy iron doors were blown inward. But the enemies were prepared. Donato's men pulled automatic weapons from beneath the pews. The neutral ground became a slaughterhouse in seconds. Aria didn't hide. She stood in the gallery, her silver revolver drawn. She saw Nikolai, the adult traitor, leveling a gun at Viktor's back. "Viktor!" she screamed. She fired. Her shot caught the traitor in the shoulder, but at the same moment, Donato fired a heavy-caliber round. The bullet tore through Viktor's side, spinning him around. The Mafia boss fell to one knee, blood erupting from his side, staining his charcoal suit. "Viktor!" Aria roared. She vaulted over the railing, dropping 10 feet to the marble floor with the grace of a predator. She reached Viktor just as Donato stepped forward to finish the job. Aria didn't hesitate. She stood over her husband's body, her red silk suit fluttering in the wind from the broken skylight. She fired until her revolver clicked empty. Donato fell, his chest a ruin of meat and gold chains. Viktor was gasping, his hand clutching his side. "The boy. Where is the boy?" Aria looked toward the doors. Little Nikolai stood there. He wasn't hiding. He was walking through the smoke, his small silver knife held tight in his hand. He walked past the dead, past the screaming, his eyes fixed on Mikhail, who was trying to crawl toward a side exit. The 5-year-old reached the elder Don. Mikhail looked up, his eyes wide with a pathetic, senile terror. "You tried to take my father's light," the boy whispered. with a precision that no 5-year-old should possess, a precision born of years of watching his father's lessons. Nikolai slid the silver blade into the gap in Mikhail's throat. The king was dead. Long live the prince. 3 hours later, the cathedral was silent, save for the crackle of fire and the hum of the Volkov cleanup crews. Viktor lay on a stretcher, his face pale but his eyes were clear. He had survived, but the ghost was fading. He had spilled his last blood for the throne. He looked at Aria, who was sitting beside him, her red suit ruined, her hands covered in the ink of their enemies. She was holding little Nikolai, who sat on her lap with a cold, aristocratic stillness. "It's done," Aria whispered. "The commission is gone. There are no more families, Viktor. There is only us." Viktor reached out and took his son's hand. He looked at the boy, then at the woman who had transformed from a librarian into the deadliest viper in the world. "The letters," Viktor rasped, his voice a shadow of its former self. "You said, 'History is written in the dark.'" "I was wrong," Aria said, looking at the rising sun through the shattered cathedral roof. "History is written in the blood of those who try to stop us." Viktor closed his eyes, a peaceful, dark smirk touching his lips. He wasn't retiring. A Mafia boss never retires. But he was passing the weight. "Nikolai," Viktor murmured. "Yes, father?" "The city is your archive now. Make sure no one ever dares to rewrite it." Aria looked at the ruby-eyed phoenix on her neck. She thought about the library, the lumpy mattress, and the girl who was afraid of her own shadow. She smiled, a sharp, beautiful look that promised 1,000 more years of reign. The library was gone. The ghost was a legend, and the viper was the law. The debt was finally paid in full.